2016, a story occurred that shocked everyone with its cruelty. A young woman was stalked by her ex-boyfriend who became increasingly dangerous with each passing day. At one point, she even had to turn to the police, but what happened next shocked all of Great Britain. Today, we will tell you about what happened to Alice Ruggles. Alice Ruggles was born on December 24, 1991, exactly one day before Christmas. Her parents, Sue Hills and Clive Ruggles, already had 2 children, and later another boy was born in the family. They lived in the tiny English village of Torlangton, located in Lake Tyshire County. The family was very close-knit, and the older children always took care of Alice and her younger brother. In the local school, the girl started attending a drama club and quickly fell in love with acting. She participated in many theatrical productions, and all her teachers noted her natural talent. After graduating from high school at the age of 18, Alice enrolled in Northumbria University, where she studied design. After receiving her diploma in 2014, she moved to a city called Gateshead and got a job at the major British media company Sky. Alice rented an apartment with her roommates because it was difficult for her to afford separate housing at first. In October 2015, when the young woman was 23, she met a man named Harry Dillon. He stumbled upon her account on Facebook through a mutual friends page. They started talking and soon became fond of each other. Through a student program, he transferred from a local Indian university to Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. After completing his studies, he decided to stay in England and join the army. After some time, he was sent to Afghanistan, where he started communicating with Alice on Facebook. At first, they just exchanged messages, then began calling each other several times a week and eventually started a relationship. They eagerly awaited the moment when Harry would return to Great Britain to finally meet. When it happened, they went on several dates, and Harry made a good impression on Alice. They had a great time, and the mutual attraction between them only grew stronger. However, after a few weeks, they had to separate again. Harry had to go back to Afghanistan for 2 more months, after which they planned to continue the relationship. The couple continued to communicate online until Harry finally returned to England in April. He lived in a military base in Edinburgh, which was almost 200 kilometers away from the city where Alice lived, but Harry tried to visit her whenever he could. Months after Harry's return to England, Alice invited him to a family celebration, and it seemed like their relationship was getting stronger. But over time, acquaintances began to notice significant changes in her behavior. Previously, she was always cheerful, sociable, and positive, but something was changing in her every day. Before we continue, I have a small request for you. We've created a new channel where we upload content related to old, historical ruins and interesting events. So, if you're interested, kindly subscribe to my channel, Decoverize, for daily interesting videos and show some love in the comments. I'll read every one of your comments. The link is in the description. Alice became withdrawn, depressed, and stopped spending time with friends. She even stopped communicating with them in social media, and no one could understand what was happening to her. She had a fight with her apartment neighbors. She packed her things and moved to her colleague's apartment. Alice's family and friends began to suspect that her new boyfriend Harry was the cause of these significant changes. At first, she was reluctant to share her relationship problems, but it became impossible to hide them over time. It turned out that Harry was not the kind and caring man he was in the first months after they met. The longer their relationship lasted, the more he tried to control every aspect of Alice's life. Harry was against her hanging out with friends or talking to other men, even if they were her old acquaintances or work colleagues. He began to monitor her social media conversations and constantly accused her of wanting to cheat on him. Every time she talked to friends or planned to go out with them, Harry would throw a tantrum. But what was even more interesting, Harry began openly cheating on Alice, meeting women from Tinder for one-night stands without any commitment. After that, he often talked about these women to Alice to make her jealous. It even got to the point where one of these women wrote to Alice on social media in August. At that moment, the young woman decided to break up with Harry, but he didn't want to let her go. He bombarded Alice with messages and calls, trying to get her back by any means necessary. At first, he said that he loved her, cried on the phone, and promised to change for the better. Then he began openly manipulating the young woman, promising to take his own life and blaming her for everything. It even got to direct threats. It turned out that Harry had secretly taken pictures of Alice while she was changing clothes, and he threatened to post these pictures on the internet if she didn't come back to him. In the end, Alice decided to simply ignore him, and then Harry changed tactics. He started calling her friends and relatives, asking them to reason with the young woman. Realizing that this also didn't work, he began writing her letters with poems about his love for her. However, soon he once again resorted to threats and blackmail. But Alice still didn't respond to these letters. Later it turned out that Harry had managed to hack her Facebook account and was monitoring her correspondence. From there he found out that since September Alice had started communicating with a man named Mike, who was an army officer and was in another country at the time. Harry was furious. He began writing to Mike that Alice was still in the with him and sleeping with him, and also wrote various nasty things about her. But by that time, Mike already knew about Harry and didn't pay any attention to his words. He continued his relationship with Alice, and it seemed that the young woman had managed to get out of this whole situation with Harry. She became sociable, cheerful, and happy again. But unfortunately, this didn't last long. On September 30th, Harry left her a voice message begging her to pick up the phone. Alice ignored him, and then he decided to go to her house. The man drove 2.5 hours from his military base to her apartment, but then he behaved quite strangely. First, he rang the doorbell and ran away. Alice was at home, but she didn't open the door because she didn't see anyone through the peephole. The situation repeated several times. Then, a few hours later, Harry climbed over the fence and approached the window of her bedroom. Alice lived on the first floor of a 2-story house with a fenced area. Harry knocked on the window and hid, leaving a box of candy and a bouquet on the windowsill. What happened greatly frightened Alice. She immediately understood that Harry was behind all of it. She briefly saw a man hiding outside her field of view, but that wasn't all. While hiding in her yard, Harry recorded several creepy voice messages, the content of which caused Alice real panic. One of them began with the words, "You said guys like me end up killing people." After these words, he began repeating multiple times that he didn't want to kill her. From his voice, Alice felt like he was primarily trying to convince himself of what he said. Finally, he wished her good night and left. All of this was already enough for Alice to contact the police. After what happened, she began to seriously fear for her life and didn't know how else to protect herself from Harry. The operator offered her 2 options for solving the problem. She could obtain a restraining order against Harry or ask the police to issue an official police information notice known in Great Britain as a PIN and allowed the police to arrest the man if he approached or contacted Alice. The young woman chose the latter option. The next day the police came to her, took a statement, and assured her that Harry would face the consequences if he bothered her again. After some time, the police called the military unit and informed the commanding officer about the measures taken against Harry. Interestingly, the police did not contact him personally, even by phone, let alone a personal visit, although they were obliged to do so by law. Learning that Alice had contacted the police, he became angry and wrote her another letter, along with a box of items that reminded him of her. In the letter, he said that because of her complaint, his phone, tablet, and laptop were taken away from him. He also promised not to bother her again. But Alice knew for sure he wouldn't just calm down like that. When she first contacted the police, they told her to call them immediately if Harry contacted her again. So she did. She told the operator about the letter and the box of items, but he didn't know what action to take in this case. Moreover, he asked Alice herself what actions she expected from them. In the end, he promised her that another officer would call her back. Of course, this response from the police shocked Alice, and she had no idea what to do next. Several hours later, an officer did call her back and listened to her entire story. He then asked if she wanted the police to arrest Harry, and here Alice made a fatal mistake. She felt sorry for him and answered negatively. However, even if he had been arrested, Harry would not have received any punishment. He would have been held for some time in the station and released. After this, Alice realized that the police could not help her in the situation that had arisen, so she was left to rely only on herself. On October 12th, 5 days after she went to the police, Alice remained depressed and frightened. She hoped to distract herself from these troubling thoughts over the weekend. Mike was supposed to come see her, and they planned to spend the next few days together. That evening, Alice returned home from work and her neighbor was not home. She began to prepare for bed while chatting with Mike about their upcoming meeting, but she did not know that Harry had been standing in the courtyard of her building and watching her. Taking advantage of the fact that Alice had left the window slightly open, he climbed into her bedroom and went to the kitchen where he took a knife and went to the bathroom where Alice was. The events that followed unfolded rapidly. Harry struck her 24 times with the knife, causing Alice to die almost instantly. After that, he left the apartment, got into his car, and drove back to his military unit. In less than an hour, Alice's neighbor returned home and found that the front door was locked from the inside. She knocked several times, hoping Alice would answer, but she did not. Then the neighbor went to the backyard to knock on the window of Alice's bedroom, but what she saw shocked her. Through the open window, she saw Alice laying on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood. She immediately called the police in a panic and told them what had happened, adding, "We knew this was going to happen. Her ex is a real psychopath." Less than 2 minutes later, the neighbor heard police sirens approaching, and with them came paramedics who confirmed Alice's death. It became immediately obvious to them that the conversation was about a murder. In connection with the fact that the neighbor named Harry Dillon as a potential killer, the police immediately began to search for him. After running the numbers of his car, they found that the man had driven from Edinburgh to Newcastle that day. His car appeared on several surveillance cameras. Just a few hours later, the police arrived at the military base and arrested Harry. They took him to the station and began to interrogate him. The man admitted that he had gone to see Alice but denied any involvement in the murder. According to him, he came to talk to her, and she allegedly came out onto the street and hit him in the face during the conversation. After that, Harry allegedly got into his car and drove back to the base, but detectives quickly found out that his story had nothing to do with reality. From the surveillance cameras, they learned that Harry had arrived at Alice's house even before she returned from work. He parked his car and waited. But that's not all. And found that while Harry was sitting in the car, he was messaging with a random girl on Tinder and arranging to meet her that same night. Detectives also found bloodstains on the steering wheel of Harry's car, and analysis showed that this blood belonged to Alice. Moreover, the man stole her phone and took it with him, which is why the geolocation of the device completely matched the movements of the killer that day, to bring charges of murder and send the case to court. However, the first hearing took place only almost a year later in April 2017. Harry's lawyers realized that with such a set of evidence against her client, they needed to come up with a new story. As a result, the man claimed that he had actually come to Alice's house to collect his things, but they had an argument, and then Alice allegedly took a knife and attacked him, accidentally inflicting 24 wounds on herself. After that, he watched her die and even heard her last words. She allegedly said that she hated her family. Of course, this delusional story was not taken seriously. Moreover, during the court hearings, another gruesome fact emerged. Before the murder, Harry had visited Alice's house several times, sneaked into the backyard, and took pictures. According to the prosecution, he carefully planned the murder in advance. 11 days later, the court handed down a guilty verdict, life imprisonment with the possibility of applying for parole in 22 years. During the reading of the verdict, the judge noted that Harry showed no remorse or compassion. Instead, he was focused only on inventing the most plausible story. Another horrific detail from Harry's past came to light during the trial. 3 years before these events, his ex-girlfriend obtained a restraining order against him because he was stalking her in the same way he would later stalk Alice, but the police simply did not know about it. After the murder, society and the media harshly criticized the police, accusing them of failing to protect Alice from a dangerous psychopath, letting the case go unchecked. Later, 2 officers were disciplined. The army also came under fire. The public was outraged that such an unbalanced and dangerous person was allowed to join. In addition, no action was taken against Harry when the pin was issued against him. Sometime later, Alice's family launched a foundation named in her honor. Its goal was to work towards ensuring the victims of stalking receive immediate and proper assistance from the police. That law enforcement agencies simply cannot provide such protection, so legislative changes are needed. In 2019, a law was passed that simplifies the issuance of restraining orders against people who stalk their victims. However, Alice's family continues to work on the foundation and hopes that it will help change the situation in the country for the better. Now, all her relatives and acquaintances believe that this tragedy could have been avoided if the police had taken their duties more seriously. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. A young woman went home on New Year's Eve and disappeared, not even making it 150 meters to her apartment. The police immediately began an investigation, which became the largest in the district. Only a month later, they were able to uncover a shocking truth that no one was prepared for. She was the youngest of 4 children with 2 sisters and a brother. They all lived together in a city called Hall. From a young age, Rachel was interested in music and dance, particularly ballet. She excelled in school and went on to attend a local college to study information technology. Later, she changed her focus and decided to pursue her passion for dance. While in college, Rachel met a guy named Mark. The two soon started dating. After some time, they decided to move in together and rented an apartment in a quiet residential area. The residential complex was just a kilometer away from Rachel's parents' home, so she would often visit them. Rachel also got a part-time job at a local bakery as a cake decorator. She quickly fell in love with this activity and began to consider pursuing a culinary education. In December 2002, when Rachel was 21, she and her boyfriend decided to get 2 kittens. Rachel took care of them, devoting most of her free time to them. Rachel and Mark made sure not to leave the kittens alone for too long, so they always tried to plan their activities so that one of them was at home and looking after the animals. As a result, they had already planned how they would celebrate New Year's Eve. Mark was supposed to go to his parents' house and come back home by night, while Rachel planned to go to a bar with her brother and celebrate New Year's Eve there. After that, she was supposed to return with her brother to her parents' house and spend the night there. On the evening of December 31st, Rachel met up with her brother and they went to a bar. Some mutual friends joined them at the bar and the group celebrated the new year. After midnight, Rachel and her brother left the establishment and arrived at their parents' home around 1:20 a.m. Before going to bed, Rachel talked to her mother and decided to call her boyfriend to see how he was doing. However, Mark did not answer the home phone, so she called his mobile. This time he picked up and said that friends had invited him to a party. Rachel was upset that Mark had left the house contrary to their agreement and left the kittens alone all night. She decided not to stay at her parents' house and planned to go home. Upon learning this, her mother tried to dissuade her daughter as it was late at night and she was concerned for her safety. Despite their lengthy argument, Rachel still headed home, promising to call her mother as soon as she arrived. Her mother waited for about an hour and a half, but there was no call from her daughter. She then called Rachel, first on her mobile and then on her home phone, but there was no answer. She thought that Rachel might have gone to the party where her boyfriend was, and that was why she wasn't answering the phone. The mother tried to reach her until about 4:30 a.m., but eventually decided to go to sleep. She woke up around 10 a.m. and saw that her husband was on the phone. She hoped that he had spoken to Rachel, but it was their eldest daughter on the line. She called her parents because she could not reach Rachel all morning and was causing her a lot of worry. Realizing that the young woman still hadn't returned home, all of her relatives began to panic. They continued to try to call her. And after some time, Mark answered the phone. The boy was surprised when he was asked, "Is Rachel home?" He said that he had returned home at around 7 a.m. and the young woman wasn't there. The young man thought that she had stayed overnight with her parents, so he didn't think much of it and went to sleep. According to Mark, there were no signs that Rachel had been home. Her things were missing. The bed was made up as it was when he left, and no one had fed the kittens. All of this made Rachel's family panic even more. They called all of their daughter's friends and other relatives, but no one had seen her that night. Rachel's parents then decided to contact the police. Despite the fact that Rachel was almost 22 years old and investigators could have waited some time after the disappearance of an adult, in this case, decided to start searching immediately. They searched her apartment and talked to all of her relatives and friends. The police immediately dismissed the idea that Rachel had simply run away on her own. Her entire biography and stories from close people contradicted such a possibility. During the conversation with the investigators, Rachel's mother remembered one moment that night when Rachel was going back to her apartment. Her mother started arguing with her literally on the doorstep of the house where they stood with the door open while the woman tried to persuade her daughter to stay. At some point, an unknown man walked down the street and Rachel's mother even thought about asking him to accompany her daughter home but changed her mind. After receiving a rather superficial description of this person, the police began searching for him, as he was walking in the same direction that Rachel was going to a few minutes later, so he might have seen something. They sent out descriptions to all patrol officers and continued to look for other clues. Detectives started to look into Mark, the boyfriend of the missing young woman. Firstly, they found out that there was an argument between them on the night when Rachel learned that he had gone to a party. During the conversation with the police, Mark didn't seem upset despite his girlfriend's disappearance in the middle of the night. All of this led investigators to believe that he might have something to do with her disappearance, so they decided to check his alibi. Mark claimed that he returned from the party after 6 a.m. The police talked to all the people who were there and they confirmed the young man's words. The young woman's relatives also insisted that he would never harm her. Investigators requested data from Rachel's mobile phone operator and bank. They found out that since her disappearance, she had not used her phone or bank cards. At that time, they could not track the location of her phone, and data from cell towers was practically useless at such a short distance. After that, the police decided to obtain all records from surveillance cameras within a 10-kilometer radius of her route. They sent patrols to every store and also spoke to residents in these areas, hoping that someone had security cameras installed. Soon they managed to spot Rachel on one of the cameras, just a couple hundred meters from her residential complex. This once again confirmed that she was heading home and not somewhere else. Detectives focused their search on this area. They brought in search dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers who combed the streets, fields, and waterways. They also began to drain streams and artificial canals to fully search them, but all of this yielded no results. Days went by and the police increasingly leaned towards the possibility that Rachel may no longer be alive. They continued their active and extensive search. 2 weeks later, they had their first worrying lead. One of the nearby channels had dried up and they found Rachel's shoe inside, the same shoe she was wearing when she left her mother's house. The next day, they found a garbage bag in the same channel with a woman's purse containing cosmetics, a phone, and other items, including Rachel Moran's passport. These items led her family and investigators to believe that she was most likely dead, and the police continued to search the channels. They considered the possibility that an unknown perpetrator had dumped Rachel's body there, but further searches yielded no results. In the following days, detectives put even more effort into the case. They decided to use a popular tactic in England where police found a woman who looked like Rachel, dressed her in similar clothing to what Rachel was wearing on the night of her disappearance, and asked her to retrace Rachel's steps. The whole thing was filmed and later handed over to local TV stations by investigators. The purpose of this experiment was to find witnesses who may have seen Rachel on the night she disappeared but didn't attach any significance to it or had forgotten. In this case, visual reconstruction of events might help them remember details, and it worked. After the footage was made public, several people contacted the police and shared their observations. The detectives checked them, but ultimately it didn't lead to any useful information. However, they did manage to obtain something significant. In addition to the witnesses, owners of CCTV cameras installed in the area also approached them. During the first few days of the investigation, the police had received most. They missed some, which proved valuable. The management of a school located approximately 150 meters from Rachel's apartment handed over their footage from the night. The police officer saw a woman walking in the direction of the same residential complex. The recording quality was very poor, but based on the time, investigators assumed it was Rachel. Just a few seconds later, someone else walked by and the detectives thought it could be the unknown criminal who might have attacked her. Unfortunately, the recording quality did not allow them to see any features. Then the police assumed that if this person was behind Rachel's abduction, he wouldn't have been able to drag her body too far because he was without a car. They assumed within a 2-kilometer radius of that location. Of course, they needed the residents' permission as well as a lot of time. Therefore, the investigators hired more than 100 officers who knocked on all residential buildings and apartments asking for permission to search the premises. The police started their work on January 28 and divided themselves into groups of 3, each of which included a specialist who knew how to properly search the premises. Several hours later, one of these groups came to Nash Court Street and the police officers began knocking on every door. After they reached the last apartment, something alarming awaited them. They immediately called the chief detective and asked him to come there urgently. When the police officers knocked on the last door, a man opened it and let them in. The officers searched the premises but didn't notice anything suspicious. However, before leaving, one of them saw a small garbage storage closet, which was quite common in such apartments, and they decided to check it out. But the closet door was locked. Officers asked the man to give them the key, but he said he couldn't remember where it was. They continued to insist that he look for the key. To make sure that there was nothing in his apartment, the man searched the apartment and after some time, he finally found the key. The police opened the door and found many garbage bags, empty packages, boxes, and other items inside. They began to clean up the mess since the closet was filled to the brim. At some point, one of the officers froze, having pulled out another bag. He saw a human foot. After a few seconds, he retrieved the rest of the garbage and realized that Rachel Moran's body was in front of him, wrapped in a blanket and barely fitting in the closet. The room was very low and the officers were greatly surprised at how the criminal managed to fit a human body in there. The police immediately arrested the apartment owner and his friend who was visiting him at the time of their visit. The tenant was 23-year-old Michael Little, who reacted calmly to his arrest, but his friend was shocked by what was happening. He did not see what was in the closet and did not understand why they were being detained. After arresting them, the officers called the chief detective and waited for his arrival. Initially, one car arrived at the scene and the police took the apartment owner's friend to the station. Little remained in the apartment with another officer waiting for the next crew. The officer decided not to waste time and tried to talk to the man. To his surprise, Little almost immediately began to confess to all the details of what had happened. He started his story with the words, "I'm so glad you found her. I've been wanting to tell someone about this for a long time." He told the officer the chronology of events that led to the young woman's death, but the officer considered this version to be questionable. According to Little, on New Year's Eve, he noticed Rachel on the street. He approached and spoke to her, inviting her to his apartment, and the young woman agreed and they went to his place. There they drank little, after which a quarrel broke out between them. Little did not specify the reason, but only said that he left for another room. Returning to the kitchen, he saw that Rachel was standing with her back to him. The man approached her and noticed that the young woman was holding a knife in her hand, and the next second she turned to him and cut his hand. Little panicked, grabbed the kitchen knife, and struck her, which resulted in Rachel's death. The police doubted the truthfulness of this story as it sounded quite illogical. However, they recorded Little's confession and soon took him to the station. During questioning, he confirmed everything he had told the officer and insisted that he acted in self-defense. When asked why he didn't call the police in that case, Little stated that he was scared and thought that no one would believe him, so he decided to hide the body in his closet. Studying his biography, the police learned that Little had an impressive criminal history. From an early age, he was caught stealing and committing other minor offenses. He was expelled from school several times, as a result of which he did not even receive a basic education. The man practically did not work, stayed at home, used alcohol and drugs. The police talked to several of his friends who said that Little often fantasized about meeting different women. Once he even told them that he was dating a beautiful blonde who was 180 centimeters tall, although his friends knew perfectly well that he was not in a relationship with anyone. This detail seemed interesting to the detectives. Rachel had approximately the same height and light hair. They assumed that Little fantasized about a young woman of this type and could choose Rachel as his victim based on these parameters. At the same time, the police established that the young woman was not acquainted with Little, although they lived on neighboring streets. The investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of that night and found out that on the evening of December 31st, the suspect met with his friends to prepare for New Year's Eve. But Little left their company. He became angry when the young woman he was trying to flirt with left with his friend. Little then went to another party. But shortly after midnight, he said he was going home. The route from the party location followed the same road that Rachel was walking on. Combining all the available facts, the detectives came to a disturbing conclusion. Remember that stranger who passed Rachel and her mother when she was trying to persuade her daughter not to walk home and even thought about asking that man to accompany Rachel? According to the police, that person was Little. This version was indirectly confirmed by surveillance camera footage. Detectives reviewed the recordings where Rachel was first recorded. About 3 minutes before that moment, a man who looked like Little walked along the same road. But on the second recording, everything changed. Rachel was captured by another camera. An unknown man was already walking behind her. If it was Little, he would have had to stop somewhere and wait for the young woman to pass, after which he began to pursue her. This version of events contradicted the man's own account, but even more contradictions arose after medical experts presented the reports on the victim's body. They found 27 stab wounds inflicted with tremendous force, and Rachel had no defensive wounds, despite Little's claim of struggling with her. In addition, some of the blows were delivered to the young woman's back, and as for the suspect himself, no cuts were found on his hands. All these facts unequivocally indicated that his story did not match reality. Based on all the available data, the detectives arrived at a more plausible version. That night, Little was angry because he was rejected at the first party. As he passed by Rachel's mother's house, he overheard part of their conversation and understood that Rachel was going home alone. Rachel also fit the type of woman that Little fantasized about, and he decided to either attack her or try to talk to her. Moving forward, he left the main road and waited for Rachel to pass by, then began to follow her. The situation could have developed in two scenarios. Or tried to flirt with her. In the second case, Rachel would likely have ignored him and walked away. Firstly, she had a boyfriend. Secondly, she wouldn't have gone to the home of a stranger who approached her on the street in the middle of the night. And thirdly, Rachel was very concerned about her kittens. When she found out that her boyfriend had left them all night, she couldn't think of anything else and tried to get home as quickly as possible. That he attacked the young woman when she was as close to his house as possible and dragged her into his apartment. Soon the forensic experts found evidence of this. There were traces of dirt on the back of Rachel's legs, indicating that she had been dragged on the ground. Forensic experts also established that the young woman was not killed in the kitchen, but in the hallway. That's where most of the bloodstains were found, which the perpetrator tried to wash off. In connection with this, the police suggested that Little killed her immediately after they were in the apartment. Nevertheless, the medical experts found that the victim had been subjected to violence and Little's DNA was found on her body. Given the alleged chronology of events, by that time Rachel could already be dead. On January 31st, Little was charged with murder. However, by that time, Little had already hired a lawyer and decided to retract his initial statement, claiming that he did not kill anyone. In the end, the case was taken to court and the trial began in October, where Little's lawyers presented a new version of events. Now the man claimed that the real killer was his friend, Mark Fuller, the same person who was arrested with him on the day the body was discovered, but later released as no evidence linked him to the crime. Little claimed that he returned to the house closer to morning and saw his friend and Rachel there. Mark told him that they had met the young woman and decided to go to Little's apartment since Mark had the keys. They all drank together, after which Rachel went with Little to the bedroom and had intimate contact with him. Soon after that, a furious Mark burst into the room. He had feelings for the young woman and went into a rage upon learning about their relationship. He grabbed a knife and inflicted numerous blows on Rachel, then threatened Little. He demanded that Little help him clean up the blood and never tell anyone about what had happened. Otherwise, he threatened to kill not only him but also his loved ones. As you can guess, nobody believed this story. It contradicted not only the evidence but also common sense. Everything pointed to Little being the killer, and there was not a single piece of evidence implicating his friend. The trial ended quickly because the defense was unable to present any evidence refuting their client's guilt. As a result, Little was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 25 years, meaning he could be released at the age of 58 if his request is approved. Rachel's murder was a strong blow to all of her relatives, but her older sister suffered the most. The young woman had diabetes, and the illness had a significant impact on her health in the wake of the stress she endured. After a prolonged struggle, she passed away in 2010. And her family blames Little for everything, so this criminal's actions led to 2 deaths. Feel free to share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. A young woman who worked at a jewelry store disappeared without a trace during her lunch break. When investigators began to unravel this mystery, they were only able to find a few unusual clues and witnesses. Only several decades later, the truth finally became known, and it was a big surprise for the detectives. Linda Reed was born in 1962 in the Australian city of Gold Coast. She grew up in a loving family, was a cheerful and energetic child, and had many friends. In her school years, Linda met a guy named Robert. The couple began dating, and at 19 years old, the young woman married him. They dreamed of creating a large and friendly family as well as building the house of their dreams. The newlyweds started working on this almost immediately after the wedding. They bought a plot of land and began saving a significant portion of their income for construction. In order to have the house ready as soon as possible, the couple decided not to spend money on rent and lived in a trailer on Robert's parents' backyard. Linda got a job as a salesperson at a jewelry store located in a large shopping center. She immediately liked this job, found common ground with the team, and the decent income allowed her to save up for her dream home even faster. December 1983 was a tense month as there was a frenzy in the store due to the approaching holidays. Linda, who was 21 years old at the time, had to work in an intensified mode. December 13th was no exception. Linda worked diligently, and only at 12 p.m. that she had the opportunity to take a break. Usually she had lunch in the same shopping center and returned earlier than the allotted time, but on that day it didn't happen. Linda's colleagues were very surprised that she did not return from her break at the appointed time, as the young woman had never been late before. The workday went on, and Linda still did not show up. Everything looked as if she had simply decided to leave her shift without informing her colleagues, but they doubted that the young woman could do such a thing as she approached her job with the utmost responsibility. Her husband was also surprised when Linda did not return home after her shift. He waited for some time and then contacted her colleagues. They told the man that his wife did not return from her break, and Robert started to seriously worry. He went to the shopping center and started walking around in search of Linda. After that, he visited several other places that the young woman regularly frequented, but she was nowhere to be found. With each passing minute of searching, he became increasingly concerned that something bad had happened to Linda. So, by 7 p.m. that evening, the man decided to call the police. The operator told him that a report of a missing adult would only be accepted after 24 hours had passed since the disappearance. Linda's mother also tried to contact them but received the same response. In the end, the relatives had to wait until the next day before the report was accepted. The police began investigating and tried to find out what Linda was doing during her break. They learned that the young woman went shopping for New Year's presents in several stores located in the same building. After that, she visited her bank branch and received a check to pay bills. The last person to see her was the shopping center security guard who noticed Linda leaving the parking lot in her car. The police could not find any other information. The young woman's relatives had no idea why Linda left in the middle of her shift and, most importantly, where she was headed. The police sent out alerts for the young woman and her car and began keeping an eye on Robert. According to statistics, husbands are more likely to commit crimes against their wives, but in this case, Robert had a reliable alibi. No other suspects were found, and according to everyone who knew Linda, she never had enemies and was generally a very positive person. As investigators tried to find new leads, several days had passed since Linda's disappearance. On the third day, the police received a report about an abandoned car that matched the description of the young woman's car. It was located in a suburban area, 20 kilometers from the shopping center. Arriving at the scene, the police realized that it was indeed Linda's car. The vehicle was parked on the side of the road next to bushes. In the 1980s, this area was almost undeveloped, with most of it covered in bushes and trees. Inside the car, the police found Christmas presents that Linda had bought before her disappearance. The doors were unlocked, and the ignition key was inside. In the salon, the police found an unusual clue. An empty menthol cigarette pack was lying next to the front passenger seat. Linda and Robert never smoked, so investigators came to the most obvious conclusion. The pack could belong to the kidnapper. The police immediately began to search for evidence, and soon they made a sad discovery. About 40 meters from the car in the stream bed of a small creek, they found Linda's body. Her hands were tied with a bikini and eyeglass cord. The victim's relatives said that she never owned either of these items. Medical experts determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation and the young woman was also subjected to violence. But at that time, specialists could not extract a DNA sample from the criminal. Thus, the investigators presented an approximate chronology of events. In their opinion, an unknown criminal attacked Linda in the parking lot of a shopping center when she came to put the gifts she bought in the car. He forced her to sit behind the wheel and drive to the place where they later found her body. After that, he subjected her to violence and killed her. There were no leads that could lead the investigators to a suspect. They decided to try to interview all the visitors of the shopping center who were there during Linda's lunch break. Of course, this was an extremely difficult task. To attract people's attention, the police took the victim's car and placed it in the shopping center, attaching a photo of the young woman and information about her disappearance to it. Investigators hoped that such a visual installation would help visitors who saw Linda that day remember some details. Several witnesses told the police that they saw a teenager with light hair in the shopping center parking lot, but investigators could not identify him. Other witnesses told something more interesting. On the day of Linda's disappearance, they saw a man who was trying to catch a ride on the highway less than a kilometer from where the victim's body was found. Soon the driver of the van turned to the police and reported that on the same day he had picked up a man who was hitchhiking on the road in the same location where other witnesses had seen him. Here's where things got interesting. The driver recounted that the man was smoking menthol cigarettes, but he was holding them all in his hand without a pack. Since an empty pack of menthol cigarettes was found in the victim's car, this became the first significant lead for investigators. Forensic specialists examined the driver's van and found a fingerprint on the glass near the passenger seat that did not match the owner's prints. Unfortunately, a comparison with existing databases did not yield any results. The suspect's description that the driver provided was also superficial and did not help the authorities find the man. No other evidence was found, and the investigation into this case came to a standstill for many months. A new lead only appeared just over a year later in 1985 when a prisoner in one of the gave investigators an interesting tip. His cellmate, Craig Andrew McConnell, had confessed to him about Linda Reed's murder. According to Craig, he and another man were trying to steal a car from the parking lot of a shopping center when Linda noticed them. Fearing that she would remember their faces and report them to the police, the criminals abducted and killed her. Detectives had come across this name before. Craig had received 2 life sentences for murders committed in 1984, and he was considered a suspect in Linda's case. But the police could not find any connection at the time. After the tip from the informant, they talked to Craig in prison, but he claimed that he had nothing to do with the murder. He added that his cellmate had made it all up and they never talked about the case. But the police were not quick to believe him. Craig committed 2 brutal murders just a few months after Linda's death, and the story told by the informant could very well be true. Forensic experts compared the suspect's fingerprints to those found on the van's glass, but they did not match. Despite this, the detectives continued to consider Craig as a possible killer, and in 1986 they decided to bring the case to trial. The only arguments against him were the words of an informant. However, he himself did not live to see the start of the trial. The man died shortly before from an overdose of illegal substances. Nevertheless, the prosecution had his entire story. According to the informant, Craig drew him a rough map of the place where he left Linda's body. Experts concluded that it matched the terrain fairly accurately, right down to the location of the trees. In addition, Craig said that Linda told the kidnappers that Rob would seek revenge. The young woman really did often call her husband by his incomplete name. The suspect also told the informant that he ate a cheese and vegetable sandwich that belonged to Linda. After her car was found, experts did find traces of cheese in her purse. Despite such precise details, all of this was circumstantial evidence and did not provide sufficient grounds for a guilty verdict. For this reason, Craig was not found guilty of Linda's murder. Investigators continued to believe that he was involved in the crime and tried to find additional evidence that would allow them to secure a guilty verdict, but all their attempts led to a dead end and ultimately the case stalled for many years. In 2014, 30 years after the murder, detectives reopened the investigation and decided to review the existing evidence. They handed samples of fingerprints from the van's glass to experts who tried to reconstruct them using modern technology. And when they finally succeeded and loaded the data into the database, the police finally had a match. The fingerprints belonged to Troy James O'Mara, who was already serving a life sentence. 1.5 years after Linda's death, he killed a 22-year-old young woman, and the details of this crime were very similar. His victim was returning from a shopping center with purchases for her upcoming wedding. When she approached her car, James forced her to sit in the car and drove her to a remote area where he subjected her to violence and killed her, tying her hands beforehand. Despite this similarity, James was never a suspect in Linda's case and was not even on the police's radar. The detectives remembered another fact. During the early stages of the investigation, several witnesses reported seeing a fair-haired teenager in the parking lot of the shopping center, and given that James was only 17 years the description. Despite this, the police wanted to find as much evidence as possible, and an interesting turn of events awaited them. It turned out that a DNA sample of the person who assaulted Linda had been stored at the warehouse all this time, although it was no longer listed as evidence in the documents. The investigators discovered it almost by chance. But here was one problem. The sample was very small and had already begun to degrade, so local experts were unable to extract the perpetrator's profile from it. Then the investigators sent it to a modern laboratory located in New Zealand. The experts managed to extract the profile, and it fully matched James' DNA. All of this took several years for the investigators. Considering that the criminal was already serving a life sentence, they could take their time and properly prepare the case for trial. In the end, James was only arrested on August 26, 2018, almost 35 years after the murder. At that time, the man was 51 years old. He had spent more than half his life in prison and had earned several more charges during that time. James twice attacked guards and even managed to escape from prison once, but he was caught the next day. After his arrest for Linda's murder, he denied his guilt and preparation for trial began. The process lasted for several years, but in March 2021, the criminal decided to confess. He said he saw Linda in the parking lot. The young woman was sitting in her car eating a sandwich. He got into her car and threatened her to drive to a remote location where he assaulted and killed her. When the judge asked him about his motives, James noted that he simply wanted to kill a random young woman that day. As a result, James was sentenced to 30 years in prison for Linda's murder, although he was given the right to apply for early release in July 2022, since he had already served more than 30 years in prison. But at the moment, he continues to serve his sentence, although he may be released in the next few years. Linda's father did not live to see the police find her killer. He had spent decades wanting to know what happened to his daughter, but he passed away after a long battle with cancer. After his wife's death, Robert vowed to never marry again as his heart belongs to Linda forever. At the trial, after the verdict was given, he thanked the investigators and declared that James had forever deprived him of his family. As for Craig and the informant story, things are quite ambiguous. It should be noted that the informant was a hardened criminal himself and could have received significant benefits from helping to solve the case. It is possible that he lied to the police and all the key facts about the case could have been gathered from the newspapers. Share your opinion about this story in the comments and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. A young woman who won a beauty contest was found dead in her own apartment. The police began searching for the culprit, not suspecting the consequences it would bring. Today we will tell you what happened to Sheila Josephine Harris and why this case outraged the public. Sheila Josephine Harris was born on February 26, 1963 in Douglas County, Nevada. From an early age, she wanted to become an actress or a model, so she actively participated in various beauty contests in her school years. When she was young, her parents divorced and her mother remarried. Later, they had 2 more daughters and Sheila actively helped her mother take care of her younger sisters. In her senior year of high school, Sheila won a local beauty contest in her district and planned to compete for Miss Nevada and Miss Carson City. In case of victory, she intended to apply to participate in the National Beauty Contest. Despite such ambitious plans, the young woman decided to obtain a higher education in the field of business and trade. After graduating from high school at the age of 18, Sheila moved to Carson City and enrolled in She rented an apartment and took a part-time job at a supermarket to cover her living expenses. The young woman took her studies and worked very seriously because she wanted to have a good education and provide for herself independently. She also dated a guy named Stephen Furlong. They tried to see each other as often as possible, but due to her studies and work, they only managed to spend time together a few times a week. On January 4, 1982, Sheila went to his house to check on Stephen's condition since he had recently broken his arm, and the young woman periodically visited him. She spent the evening with him and his parents, after which she went home. The next day, Sheila was supposed to start her morning shift at the supermarket, so she wanted to go to bed early. Despite his injury, Stephen decided to see her off and departed at the entrance to the residential complex. The next day, Sheila did not show up for work. The store manager noticed her absence and was greatly surprised since the young woman had never been late, not even once. He called her home phone, but there was no answer. So he contacted Sheila's mother and asked, "Has anything happened to her?" At first, her mother thought that Sheila might have just overslept. But when the building manager said he had called her home phone, the woman became nervous. She decided to go to Sheila's apartment and asked her friend to accompany her because she was very worried and afraid to go alone. The mother arrived at the apartment complex with a spare set of keys and her friend entered the apartment first. There she was met with a horrifying sight that made her scream. Sheila lay in bed without signs of life. There was blood around her and bruises were visible all over her neck. Her friend tried to stop the young woman's mother from seeing this heart-wrenching sight, but she still entered the apartment and saw her dead daughter. Police who arrived at the scene began to investigate the crime scene. They immediately realized that the young woman had been strangled and had been dealt several strong blows with a heavy object. A dent was found in the wall near the bed, presumably left by Sheila herself trying to fend off the attacker. In addition, wood chips were found on her clothing and body. Medical examiners concluded that the young woman had been tied up and subjected to violence. The perpetrator had dealt her several blows, presumably with a board or other heavy piece of wood, and then strangled her with an electric cable which caused her death. Investigators could not find either the board or the cable in the apartment, but they noticed that the wire had been ripped off the desk lamp, which could have been the murder weapon. Experts were able to extract biological material from the perpetrator, but they could not conduct a DNA test in 1982. At first, the detectives thought that this crime could have been committed without preparation and that the perpetrator could have been mentally unstable. Their thoughts were led to this by the cruelty with which he dealt with his victim. However, it quickly became clear that this attack was meticulously planned. Firstly, no signs of forced entry were found on the door, which means Sheila must have let the perpetrator in herself. Secondly, none of the neighbors in the apartment building heard anything. The killer must have carefully planned every step to carry out such a cruel crime without making a sound. Additionally, the killer took a wire and a wooden board, depriving the police of two important pieces of evidence. All of this led investigators to believe that the perpetrator was not a first-time offender, possibly a serial killer or someone who had been planning the attack long before it happened. With almost no evidence, investigators began searching for witnesses. They interviewed all of the building's residents, but none of them noticed anything suspicious that night. The area where Sheila lived was on the outskirts of the city and was not considered safe. She chose the apartment because the rent was low and she could not afford to live in a more prestigious neighborhood on her salary from the supermarket. This only complicated the police's work since many people in this area were somehow involved in criminal activity. For a month after the murder, investigators carefully studied local residents and tried to identify who might be involved. As a result, they questioned about 70 men, but they were unable to establish their involvement. From the first days, the police had the most obvious suspect, Sheila's boyfriend, Stephen. Statistics show that it is often people close to the victim who commit such crimes, and Stephen might have been the last person to see Sheila before the murder. He said he accompanied her to the entrance, but detectives were not quick to believe him. The young man did not have an alibi for the rest of that day and could not prove that he did not enter Sheila's apartment. During the investigation, another problem arose. Local media learned the detectives were considering Stephen as a suspect. Journalists quickly discovered that the young man's family had close ties to the police. His brother was the sheriff of Carson City, and his father held the same position before retiring. As a result, newspapers began to speculate on the topic of whether the police were covering up the young woman's killer. That Stephen was behind the crime and his brother and father were using their position and connections to cover it up. This led to people protesting, sending angry letters to Stephen and his family, and even threatening violence. The residents of Carson City demanded that the teenager be immediately arrested, and some even called for the death penalty. The situation was further complicated by the fact that just a few days after Stephen's murder, he was arrested for being drunk in public. Nevertheless, investigators tried to determine if the boy had a motive for committing such a crime. After speaking with Sheila's friends, they concluded that the couple had never had any serious problems and that the young woman had never complained of aggression from Stephen. In addition, the victim suffered serious injuries that required the killer exert significant effort, and Stephen had a broken arm at the time, making it almost impossible for him to do this. As a result, the detectives began to lean towards the belief in the boy's innocence, but it was too late. Under pressure from the public, threats, and constant accusations, Stephen took his own life before he could be definitively cleared of suspicion. After this, the police had only one candidate for the role of the murderer, a gardener and handyman named David Winfield Mitchell, who was assigned to the residential complex where Sheila lived. There was no direct evidence against him, but several indirect factors made investigators suspicious. Firstly, the man could enter any apartment in the complex to do some repair work. Secondly, shortly after the murder, he resigned and left in an unknown direction. The police tried to find him, but he seemed to have disappeared. When suspicions began to mount against Mitchell, detectives re-interviewed residents of the complex and other employees. They tried to find out if anyone had noticed any strange or suspicious behavior from the Mitchell couldn't take his eyes off pretty young women when they passed by. He silently watched them until they were out of sight. Several tenants found this strange, and investigators increasingly believed that he was the one who killed Sheila. A man was declared wanted, but over the next several years investigators failed to obtain any leads on his whereabouts. Meanwhile, they found a hair in the victim's apartment that could have belonged to Mitchell. He was originally from the small island state of Trinidad and Tobago, and experts were able to determine that the hair found matched his ethnicity. DNA analysis was still unavailable in those days, so they couldn't determine a 100% match with Mitchell's DNA. In 1986, 4 years after the murder, the police finally received a lead on the man's whereabouts. He was living outside the state and was soon arrested. During questioning, Mitchell denied his guilt, and the detectives had only one card, a hair that presumably belonged to him. The suspect himself claimed that he had cleaned the apartment a month before Sheila moved in, which should explain where his hair came from. Investigators continued to believe that he was the one who killed the young woman, but they had no serious evidence. They understood that this case had zero chances in court, so they decided to release Mitchell. No judge would have found him guilty based solely on one hair, which could indeed have been left there during cleaning. Since then, there have been no developments in this case. Investigators were convinced that it was Mitchell who was the killer. So they didn't really try to find other suspects, but they couldn't prove the man's guilt, so the investigation was practically frozen. It was only in 1999, 13 years later, that the case was reopened. Sheila's mother heard about how new DNA analysis technologies could help solve such crimes and contacted the detective in charge of the case. The woman convinced him to send the killer's biological material to the laboratory and request a comparison with Mitchell's blood, which had been given after the questioning in 1986. After a long wait, the investigators finally received the long-awaited results. The semen sample from the victim's body matched David Mitchell's DNA completely. Experts also confirmed that it was his voice that was found in the victim's apartment. Thus, the police obtained 100% confirmation of his guilt. They faced another problem. Mitchell had left the USA for his home country where he got a job as a security guard in a government institution. Now investigators had to obtain his extradition, which was quite problematic. They had to go through all the bureaucratic red tape and prove to the government of Trinidad and Tobago that it was Mitchell who committed the murder. This process took several years, and federal authorities and the state government engaged in dialogue with the other state for the next 7 years until 2006, when a decision was finally made to extradite him. The suspect was brought to Carson City, and soon one of the most high-profile trials in the state's history began. Firstly, DNA analysis was not as actively used in those days as it is now, and this technology still raised some doubts in society. Secondly, journalists paid a lot of attention to the fact that the victim's friend, Stephen, had taken his own life because of accusations against him. And now the court had to decide whether David was the real killer or whether the entire town had wrongly believed Stephen was guilty. Mitchell's lawyer used these doubts in his strategy and insisted that Stephen was the real killer and DNA analysis could be mistaken. The prosecution side refuted these arguments, citing compelling evidence that DNA testing in modern conditions has extremely low chances of error. Moreover, they had another indirect argument. On the day of the murder, Stephen had a cast on his hand. Firstly, the young man was unlikely to have been able to inflict all these injuries on the victim using one hand. Secondly, particles of the cast would undoubtedly have been found at the crime scene, but there were none. But these were not the only arguments of the prosecution side. During the trial, they revealed information that had not been publicly available before. It turned out that Mitchell had already been convicted of 5 episodes of violence against women. In the late 1960s, when the suspect lived in New York, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for attacking 3 young women in their homes. Mitchell broke into their home, tied women with an electric cable, and subjected them to violence. After his release from prison, he moved to California, where in 1979 he broke into the house of 2 sisters. There he attempted to assault them, but the young women managed to fend him off. They contacted the police, and 9 months later, Mitchell was arrested. Here, the most interesting part began. Despite his previous sentence, the man received only 3 years in prison, of which he served 1.5 and was released on parole. He was supposed to be deported to his homeland, but the man disappeared from the police, moved to Carson City, and got a job as a gardener in that same complex. All these facts outraged not only Sheila's family, but also the public. If the system had not allowed him to get out so early, the young woman would most likely be alive. The same goes for the management of the residential complex, which without knowing it, hired a serial rapist who fled from the police. The work of investigators also raised questions after Sheila's murder. They had no idea about Mitchell's criminal history. According to the prosecution's version, on the evening of Sheila's murder, David knocked on her door and said that he needed to do some repair work. He should have had a board with him, which he used to stun the victim. Then Mitchell committed all these atrocities with her and left the scene, taking the board and the electric cable with him. As a result, it took the jury only 30 minutes to unanimously find David guilty of the young woman's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, but his lawyer tried to get more lenient conditions. He pointed out that for 25 years after the murder, Mitchell had reformed, lived an honest life, and had not harmed anyone. Fortunately, the court rejected these demands and left the original sentence in force. At the time we began his prison term, David was 63 years old. He spent most of his life on the loose, and now he only has to spend the rest of his days behind bars. Sheila's mother thanked the court for not giving this monster the opportunity to walk free. She stated that if he had not been released early in the early 1980s, her daughter would be alive now. In all the story, there remained one question that haunted investigators. How many more victims could Mitchell have had? All his known crimes are undoubtedly serial in nature, so the criminal could have attacked other women. He spent 25 years at large out of police sight, and there is a high probability that his actions could have harmed other people. But whether the police will be able to uncover the truth is a big question. Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. A student who came to visit her family for a holiday went for a run and disappeared without a trace. The residents of the small village were shaken by this event, as nothing like this had ever happened in their area before. Detectives began an investigation that lasted for many years, and it was only after 28 years that everyone learned the gruesome truth that of the small village. Mandy Stavik was born on April 16, 1971 in the American city of Bellingham, Washington. She grew up in a large family with loving parents, 2 brothers and a sister. Soon after Mandy's birth, her parents decided to move to a town called Palmer, Alaska. This place was known for its picturesque nature, safety, and the unity of its few thousand residents. The family lived in this town for several years, but when Mandy was 3 years old, her parents decided to divorce and she stayed with her mother. Nevertheless, she continued to see her father almost every day. A year later, a terrible tragedy struck their family. Mandy's 17-year-old brother went on a hunting trip and disappeared. The police later found his body, which had almost 20 bullet wounds. Despite all the investigators' efforts to solve the case, they could not find any suspects. For Mandy's family, this event was a real shock, but she continued to grow up joyful and active. She excelled academically, participated in many sports, and played various musical instruments. When Mandy was 12 years old, her mother decided to move back to Washington, to a small village called Acme, whose population at that time was less than 300 people, and all the residents knew each other well. There were practically no serious crimes in this place, and the woman decided that she and her 3 children would be better off there. Mandy enrolled in the local school, quickly made friends, continued to play sports, joined the school music group, and was a good friend, and became a cheerleader. In addition, she loved the local nature and enjoyed going for runs towards the picturesque river. When Mandy was 17 years old, another tragedy struck her family. After the divorce, her father stayed in Palmer and started a new family, having several children, and in 1988, Mandy's stepbrother drowned in a river. It was another blow for her and reminded her of her older brother's death. After graduating from high school, Mandy enrolled in Central Washington University in 1989, which was 3 hours away from her home. She wanted to become a pilot and strove to get straight A's. She lived in a dormitory, but whenever she had the chance, she visited her family, spent Thanksgiving with her relatives, and planned to stay there for a few more days. On November 24th, the day after the holiday, Mandy decided to go for a run. Usually, her mother accompanied her and rode her bike next to her, but this time she stayed home because her sister had come to visit her briefly. So, Mandy set off alone, taking the family's German Shepherd with, and ran along the road to the river, after which she turned around and ran back, totaling about 5 kilometers. Usually the run took less than an hour, but this time Mandy was clearly delayed. When her brother returned home, he was surprised that Mandy was still not back. He was visiting a friend whose house was located along the road. The brother saw Mandy run back towards home, but after a few minutes she ran in the opposite direction. He thought she had decided to do another lap, but even considering that, she should have returned home much earlier than him. As time passed, Mandy's relatives began to worry seriously about her. In addition to the fact that she had never run for so long before, she had plans for the evening. Before heading home for the holiday, she invited her dorm mate, who came with her. They were planning to go to a neighboring town that day to meet with friends. 2 hours later, something happened that made the whole family worry even more. Their German Shepherd returned home without Mandy, which was extremely strange. The mother of a young woman who had already lost a child once decided to immediately contact the police. And despite Mandy being 18 years old, the sheriff agreed to start the search right after the woman's call. Meanwhile, the mother began calling literally every resident of the village and asking if they had seen her daughter upon hearing that Mandy had disappeared. Many of them went out into the street and quickly organized their own search together with the young woman's relatives. They walked along the route she had run several times, but she was not found. Meanwhile, the police began questioning people close to Mandy. They learned that the young woman had a boyfriend named Rick whom she'd been dating since high school. The young woman's mother also said that the couple had broken up and gotten back together again. The investigators spoke with him but found no reason to suspect the young man. They questioned several other people while combing the area with the villagers. People on SUVs, horses, and helicopters had joined the search. The local dog handler even tried to work with a shepherd dog, hoping that it would lead them to Mandy. However, the dog was clearly frightened and did not want to leave the porch of its house. The search continued until late at night, but it yielded no results. The next day it continued and the police managed to find the first worrying clue. Volunteers found women's sports pants on one of the back roads. They were covered in mud, looked old, and had several holes. The pants were immediately shown to Mandy's mother, but she hesitated to say that they belonged to her daughter. Despite this, the police still sent them to the laboratory. Experts found traces of male semen on them. From all the men who were familiar with Mandy and were in the area, but no matches were found. The FBI's general database, which contains DNA of convicted criminals, did not exist yet that year, so investigators could not do anything with this clue. Meanwhile, specialists with search dogs began to participate in the search and soon they discovered a new lead. They managed to find traces of the young woman on the dirt road as well as the tracks of her sheepdog. But there was one strange moment. Their tracks stopped at the same place. From this, only one conclusion could be drawn. Mandy must have gotten into someone's car. Detectives suggested that she may have been abducted and forced into a car. But experts disproved this assumption, as there would have been a different scene at the point where the tracks ended, as the young woman should have resisted. In reality, it looked as though she got into the car of her own accord, meaning that the driver could have been someone she knew. On the third day of the search, police, along with firefighters, began searching the nearby river that flowed alongside the road where the young woman was last seen. There they made a distressing discovery. About 5 kilometers downstream from the village, they noticed a female body in the water. After retrieving it, they immediately realized that it was Mandy, as she was naked except for her socks and sneakers. The police did not see any serious injuries except for several large scratches on her legs. In connection with this, they began to speculate if the young woman could have drowned, but this version made no sense. Firstly, it was the end of November and the water in the river was very cold, so Mandy could not have gone into it voluntarily, especially without clothes. In addition, the depth of the river in that place was significantly lower than human height, and the young woman could have stood there safely. The medical experts examined the victim's body and found a head injury which was most likely caused by a strong blow. However, they determined that this injury could not have been the cause of death. In the end, the experts concluded that the young woman died of suffocation in the water. In other words, she drowned. In addition, the medical experts found evidence of violence against the victim and were able to extract biological material from the perpetrator as well as detect male DNA under the victim's fingernails. Based on all this, the police developed the most likely version of what happened. Someone kidnapped Mandy on the road, dragged her into a car, and drove her to the river where an unknown perpetrator subjected her to violence. After that, the young woman managed to escape, evidenced by the scratches on her legs, most likely caused by prickly vegetation along the riverbank. At some point, the criminal caught up to Mandy, hit her on the head, and threw her into the water. Forensic experts identified a DNA profile and compared it to samples from everyone who was in any way connected to the case. In total, they checked over 30 men, but no matches were found. Police continued to search for any leads by questioning all residents of the village and surrounding areas. Apart from Mandy's brother, another Asimi resident saw her on the day of her disappearance. The man parked near his house and saw the young woman running along the road. When she disappeared from view, a dark pickup truck drove past. At that moment, the man did not attach any importance to it. But after Mandy's murder, he shared his observation with the police. He could not remember the model of the pickup truck and refused to provide detectives with his DNA sample. This behavior seemed suspicious and they obtained a court order to compel the man to give his DNA. However, it did not match the sample found on the victim's body. The murder received active media coverage. Police received several thousand tips. Unfortunately, they all led to dead ends. And as a result, the investigation dragged on for years. Detectives were unable to identify any serious suspects, although they continued to actively consider various candidates. At some point, investigators speculated that an unknown serial killer known as the Green River Killer might be behind the crime. He was suspected of killing dozens of young women and he often dumped their bodies in rivers. However, no evidence in favor of this version was found. Even when the killer was caught and his identity became known, investigators could not link him to Mandy's murder. Due to the lack of evidence and new suspects, the investigation of this case periodically, detectives retrieved it from the archives, trying to find some fresh ideas, but it did not produce any results. In 2009, 20 years after Mandy's death, a new detective from the local police department reopened the investigation. Given that no new evidence had emerged over the past 2 decades, he decided to take a different approach. Together with his colleagues, they went around the entire village and surrounding areas, asking every male resident to provide their DNA sample. The detective's plan was quite simple. He understood that the killer of Mandy was most likely a local resident, and if they collected DNA samples from literally every man, there was a decent chance of finding the culprit among them. And its surroundings, this task seemed quite straightforward. But in practice, it turned out to be much more difficult. It took the police a whole 4 years to check all the men, and in the end, they didn't get a single match. The detectives realized that in 20 years since the murder, the killer could have moved somewhere else or even died. So, they began to dig through and try to track down literally every man who lived in the area at the time of 1989. In 2013, the police received an unexpected lead. 2 women who grew up in the same village as Mandy went to a water park with their children. As they chatted, they remembered the infamous murder and began to discuss it. At some point, one of the women said that she suspected who might have killed Mandy. The other replied that she also suspected a specific person. And they both named the same name, Timothy Bass. At the time of the murder, he was 21 years old and lived just a few houses away from the victim. The women were shocked that they had been suspecting the same person all this time. But even more interesting were the reasons why they considered Timothy to be the culprit. One of the women said that Timothy had been hitting on her when they were teenagers. Once, when she was in a car with Timothy and some other friends, he began to aggressively pursue her and make advances. The other friends intervened, and since then, the woman had been seriously afraid of being near this person. The second woman's story was even more shocking. Several years after Mandy's murder, when the woman was already living with her husband and their newborn baby, Timothy knocked on her door one evening while her husband was at work. The woman was not surprised by his visit since he and her husband were friends. Timothy said that he had been passing by after hunting and needed to use the phone. The woman let him in, but Timothy started to behave strangely. Instead of making a call, he stood there with the phone in his hand and then put it down. He then began to tell the woman that he had been in love with her for a long time and offered to engage in a sexual relationship. She refused and demanded that he leave. But Timothy continued to insist aggressively. The woman then threatened to call the police, and only after that did he leave their home. Sharing these stories, they decided to go to the police together and talk about their suspicions about Timothy. When asked why they waited so long, the woman replied that they were not sure of his involvement in the murder. In such a small community, they would never be forgiven if they accused an innocent person of murder, so none of them dared to share this information. Detectives immediately became interested in this person and noticed something interesting. During the initial investigation, none of their colleagues interviewed Timothy or asked him to provide a DNA sample. This was very strange. The young man did not appear in old police reports, despite being acquainted with the victim, living nearby and his house being next to the same road that the young woman ran on. Digging deeper, investigators also found that Mandy was friends with his younger brother, Tom. Another suspicious moment was that Timothy moved to another city less than 2 months after the murder. Perhaps this was the reason why the guy remained out of the police's sight. At that time, they were busy with a huge amount of leads and checking people who voluntarily cooperated with them. Timothy settled in the town of Emerson, located 40 kilometers from his old home. Shortly before moving, he married and eventually had 3 children. Opening his criminal history, detectives found another alarming fact. In 2010, his wife filed a statement with the police that Timothy had beaten her and their children, but the investigators were most surprised by one small detail contained in this statement. In it, his wife described why Timothy was a danger to their family. Among the stories of domestic violence, she briefly mentioned her husband's strange behavior. While watching documentary crime films, when they watched similar programs together, Timothy for how poorly they commit murders, leaving behind a lot of evidence. The man also loved to say that he would never make the same mistakes and would not have been caught. After studying all this information, the detectives began to seriously consider his involvement in Mandy's murder. They went to his house to ask a series of questions and request a voluntary DNA sample. When the most interesting part began, Timothy claimed that he did not remember the crime and could not even remember who Mandy Stavik was. This statement immediately made detectives doubt his words. First of all the residents of the village with a population of less than 300 knew each other. Secondly, Timothy lived just a few houses away from the Stavik family, and it was simply impossible to imagine that he did not know her. Moreover, after the murder, this case was talked about not only in the village itself, but also in all neighboring towns. It was the first such crime in the area in many years, and for local residents, this topic remained number one for many months. Therefore, detectives did not hurry to believe the man's words, and they asked him to provide a DNA sample. But Timothy refused, which aroused even more suspicion. Unfortunately, they had absolutely no evidence that could link him to the murder, so investigators could not obtain a court order that would require the man to provide his DNA. Then they decided to go another way. Detectives found out that Timothy had worked as a courier at a bakery located in a neighboring town for many years. They went there and talked to the manager, asking him to provide them with information about Timothy's routes for the next few days. The police planned to track him and get some item on which the man could leave his DNA. They did not tell the manager which particular crime their employee was suspected of. Detectives only said that an investigation was underway, but the woman refused to provide this information without the permission of higher management. The police contacted them and they demanded a court order. Thus, investigators were again at a dead end. They continued to study Timothy's biography and tried to find new clues that would allow them to obtain the much-needed court decision. But all their attempts led to nothing, and the case was stalled for several more years. In 2015, the police came to his house again, asked a few questions, and requested a DNA sample, but he refused again. It continued until 2017 when something unexpected happened. A woman named Kim Wagner, who was a manager at the bakery, went to a bar with her husband and friends, all of whom used to live in Acme and were around the same age as Mandy when she was murdered. At some point, they started talking about the case, which had haunted the locals for decades. Suddenly, one of the friends mentioned Timothy Bass, who lived near the victim's home, and it dawned on Kim when the police came to her workplace and asked for information about his whereabouts. She didn't even think it could be related to Mandy Stavik's murder. And then Kim started thinking that her colleague was the killer. This thought stayed with her for a long time. At some point, detectives came to her workplace again, hoping that she had changed her position since their previous conversation, and their hope was justified. Kim invited the investigators to her office and asked directly, do they suspect Timothy of killing Mandy? The police were surprised but did not deny it, and then the woman provided them with all the necessary information and interesting observations about her colleague. She had known the man for many years and always found him strange. When one of her friends mentioned that Bass lived near Mandy's home during those years, she began to seriously consider his involvement in the case. So she decided to help the investigators. The detective started following Timothy, and new difficulties emerged. He always wore gloves at work, which prevented experts from taking a DNA sample from objects he touched. The man also did not smoke, so the police could not even obtain a cigarette but with his saliva. Bass did not even have a workplace in the bakery since he worked exclusively on delivering products. In addition, another strange fact complicated the investigators' task. Timothy never threw away his garbage at work. He stored it in his van and took it home. The detectives immediately realized that such behavior could not be a coincidence. Apparently, Timothy understood that the police suspected him of Mandy's murder and started making sure that they did not get any items with his DNA. But in the end, the detectives were lucky to find out that they couldn't obtain the suspect's biological material. Kim offered to help. Laws work in such a way that police officers are not allowed to ask third parties to obtain evidence for them. In such a case, the evidence will not be admissible in court even if the suspect's guilt is obvious. However, if any person voluntarily hands over evidence to the investigators, they have the right to accept and use it. Thus, Kim offered to obtain some DNA samples from Bass, and the detectives waited. The suspect was very careful, and it took the woman a long time to achieve her goal. Only after 3 months did she see the man drink Coke from a plastic cup and then throw it away in the trash with the can. Kim waited until Timothy left, took both pieces of evidence, and handed them over to the police. They immediately sent the can with the count to the laboratory, and the experts extracted a DNA profile from them. It fully matched the biological material found on Mandy's body. Having finally obtained the long-awaited evidence, the police immediately went after the man and arrested him. 28 years after the murder, the suspect was finally charged. During the interrogation, Timothy denied his guilt until the investigators told him about the DNA sample match. Hearing this, the man immediately changed his story and said that he and Mandy had a secret affair. They supposedly started dating many months before her murder and had to hide their relationship from everyone because she had a boyfriend. According to Timothy, on the day of her death, Mandy came to his house during her jog. They had an intimate encounter and she left. He added that his father was at home at the time, but it was impossible to use him as a witness since he had passed away long ago. The detectives did not believe this story for a second. In their opinion, Timothy made up the whole story about the secret affair just to explain the presence of his DNA on the victim's body. Moreover, as proof of his words, he referred to his deceased father who could not refute this information. Investigators talked to Mandy's relatives and friends and they all expressed complete confidence that the young woman would never date Timothy. He was very strange, avoided communication with other people, and spent most of his time alone. The detectives decided to speak with Timothy's wife. Despite the fact that the woman had filed statements against her husband and lived separately, they were still married. Here, the police were waiting for another interesting turn. The woman suddenly said that on the day of Mandy's murder, she was with Timothy at his house and he was there all day. The detectives did not believe her story, but her words created possible difficulties for the court. On the other hand, they contradicted Timothy's version, according to which Mandy came to his house on the day of the murder and had an intimate relationship with him. The trial began in May 2019. Timothy's lawyer continued to insist that his client was innocent and that his DNA got on the victim's body as a result of a consensual intimate contact. The prosecution, however, insisted that there was no evidence to support this version. Timothy never called Mandy, never wrote her notes or letters, and no one among the witnesses saw them together. It was much more likely that Bass had a one-sided crush on the young woman and was even obsessed with her. Investigators found out that the guy started attending all the sports matches when Mandy joined the school team. Before that, he had absolutely no interest in sports. In addition, his windows overlooked the road where the young woman was running and he could watch her during her runs. He decided to talk to her and caught up with her. Perhaps the guy started to harass Mandy, but the young woman resisted, or he persuaded her to get into his car on some pretext. Later, Bass took her to a deserted place, subjected her to violence, and then the young woman managed to escape. The guy caught up with her near the riverbank, hit her on the head with some object, and threw her body into the water. Timothy's wife testified as a witness in court who, by that time, had already divorced him, and this time she surprised everyone again. Instead of sticking to her original story, the woman told a new one. According to her, she did not remember that she was at Timothy's house on the day of the murder. The woman added that Bass had forced her to lie to the police during the first interrogation. He could go to jail. At that time, she seriously feared that her husband might harm her or her children, so she agreed to lie to the police. This deprived the suspect of his only alibi, but the court heard even more interesting details. Tom's younger brother told that after Timothy was asked for a DNA sample, he started to get very anxious about it. When Tom asked him what was going on, his brother told him the same story about a secret affair with the victim. Timothy also asked him to tell the police that he had also had a sexual relationship with Mandy, but Tom refused to lie. Even Timothy's own mother testified against him when she visited him in jail, and he passed her a note asking her to lie to the police that they had gone to the store together on the day of the murder to buy Christmas gifts. But she refused to lie. In the note, Timothy also asked her to testify against his own father and try to convince investigators that he was the real killer. After all this, the defendant's lawyer tried to convince the jurors that Timothy's DNA sample had been obtained illegally. He insisted that the police had asked a civilian to obtain the man's biological material outside the rules. However, Kim Wagner refuted these claims and said that she had offered her help to the police. In 1989, this murder deeply shook her and she continued to think about it regularly for decades. Learning that her colleague was a suspect, she wanted to help solve the case. Moreover, by that time, she already had a daughter and Kim could barely imagine what Mandy's mother felt. During those years, the trial lasted several weeks, and after all the evidence presented, the jury found Timothy Bass guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison with the possibility of applying for early release after 24 years. Mandy's mother, who was 83 years old at the time, thanked the detectives for their work. Although she had lost 2 children in her life, she was still glad that the guilty party had been punished. In 1990, Mandy's relatives established a scholarship in her name at the high school where she attended. They continue to support this program to this day, annually awarding the most talented students who study music. The foundation of this scholarship was $25,000 collected by the residents of Acme and other towns. Initially, this money was offered as a reward for information. But after the case was solved, it was decided to put it into this program. Share your opinion on the story in the comments, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. A young woman was found dead at her workplace. Detectives found several unusual clues, but they were unable to catch the culprit. Several years later, when the police re-examined all the clues, they made a very unexpected breakthrough. Carrie Nelson was born on December 13, 1980, in the small American town of Laverne, Minnesota. She had loving parents, a younger sister, and many friends. Carrie was kind, empathetic, and always tried to help her loved ones. After graduating from the local high school, she enrolled in college in the neighboring state of North Dakota. She wanted to become a doctor so that she could help others. While in college, she met a young man named Mike Kellen, and they became engaged after a while. Carrie tried to balance her college studies with part-time work at the National Blue Mound State Park located near her hometown. Her duties included selling park tickets and escorting guests who came to relax at the camping site, go hiking, or see the bison. In addition to being a relatively easy job, she could also spend a lot of time in nature, enjoying the picturesque landscapes. On May 20, 2001, she went to work as usual. That day, besides her, only one young woman named Rebecca, who was doing an internship at the park, was working there. In addition to her main duties, Carrie had to train and introduce her to the work process. Carrie's shift started at 8 a.m. and was supposed to end at 3:30 p.m. For most of the day, she was with Rebecca, explaining the work nuances. Around 12:45, Rebecca went to the office building located at the other end of the park, and Carrie stayed in a small room at the entrance. Rebecca returned around 2:30 p.m. She entered the building through the back door and immediately saw a horrific scene. Carrie lay motionless on the floor with a pool of blood near her head. At around the same time, a shocked Rebecca heard the front door. Thinking it might be the same person who attacked her colleague, she immediately ran out through the back door and rushed home. The young woman lived in a house located within the park grounds because her father was a manager, so she quickly ran there. Rebecca told her parents what had happened, and her father immediately ran there while the young woman's mother called the police. The man arrived at the building and found no one there except Carrie. He tried to feel her pulse and realized that she was dead. After that, he closed the curtains, locked the front door, and called 911. At around the same time, another call came in to the police. It turned out that when Rebecca discovered her colleague's body inside, a park visitor walked in, not the attacker. The woman went to the registration desk and saw Carrie's body next to a puddle of blood, then returned to her car and also called 911. Police arrived on the scene and began their investigation. The young woman's body was lying behind the registration desk where phones and cash registers were located, and things and papers were scattered around. One of the phone receivers was off the hook, the plastic pen of Carrie's chair was broken, and its pieces were on the floor. Based on this, the police assumed that a struggle had taken place between the victim and the attacker. After talking to the managers, the investigators found out that 2 bank bags intended for money storage had disappeared from the building. In addition, cash was taken from the cash register, with the total amount stolen being approximately $2,000. On the floor, detectives found several clues. Men's wristwatches with a torn strap and a pack of cigarettes. Considering that Carrie did not smoke, the police assumed that the cigarettes were left by her killer. As for the watches, they assumed that the young woman tore them off the perpetrators during the struggle. Large particles of orange-colored stone were also found on the floor. The manager told investigators that these particles likely came from the decorative stone with the park's name, which was located on the registration desk. The police searched all the rooms and could not find the perpetrator. Considering that blood spatters were visible on the walls and ceiling of the room, they immediately assumed that this stone was the murder weapon. At the same time, their colleagues blocked the road leading to the park entrance and began questioning all visitors. The couple who stopped at the campground reported that around 2:30 p.m. a white car with a brown vinyl top drove past them at high speed. Unfortunately, they did not remember the model or license plate number of the vehicle. The investigation was complicated by the fact that there were no surveillance cameras in the park since crimes that were very rare. The available evidence included a wristwatch, a pack of cigarettes, and the vague testimony of witnesses. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that the cause of death was blows to the head with a heavy object. They suggested that the perpetrator may have used a large decorative stone, but this version could only be confirmed after its discovery. According to the investigators, the attack on Carrie occurred between 2 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. They found a love letter that she had written to her fiancé at her workplace. In the letter, Carrie expressed her eagerness for their wedding and described her desire to have 2 children. She put the date and time of 2 p.m. that day on the letter. Another interesting fact was that the men's watch found next to the victim's body stopped at 2:16 p.m. Perhaps they stopped working just after Carrie had taken them off her attacker's wrist. Police cordoned off the park and began searching for additional clues. 5 days later, they found the decorative stone in a nearby stream. Apparently, the killer took it with him and threw it into the stream from a bridge. While driving over it, medical experts compared the relief of the stone with Carrie's head injuries and confirmed that it was the murder weapon. However, the water had washed away all fingerprints and DNA traces that the perpetrator may have left. No other clues were found and the police began searching for a possible suspect. They first looked closely at Carrie's fiancé, but he had a reliable alibi. At the time of the murder, he was attending a funeral about 110 kilometers away from the park. Around 3 p.m. that day, he tried to call Carrie at her work phone. At that time, he had no idea that his fiancé was dead. Detectives interviewed park employees and received an interesting lead. Several people told them that Carrie had complained to them multiple times about her 26-year-old colleague named Stephen. Carrie reported that he continuously asked her out on a date despite her being engaged. Stephen ignored her refusals and behaved quite persistently, causing Carrie to fear him. Additionally, the man used heavy narcotics and sold them to park visitors. Carrie mentioned to her colleagues that she was considering reporting him to the police or management. The detectives immediately questioned him and he did not have a reliable alibi for the time of the murder. He did not work that day and claimed he was at his daughter's birthday party a few kilometers away from the park. However, he arrived at the party around 3 p.m., which means he could have had enough time to commit the crime. In addition, he drove a white Cadillac. While witnesses saw a light-colored vehicle leaving the park at high speed. Digging deeper, the detectives found out that Stephen had financial difficulties. This gave him a motive to commit robbery, especially since he knew where the money was kept. The detectives also suspected that he may have learned about Carrie's plans to report him and decided to murder her. They seized his car and took a DNA sample from him. Meanwhile, the forensic team finished collecting fingerprints and DNA samples from the crime scene, including DNA from a men's wristwatch. In total, 135 different fingerprints were found at the scene, excluding all park employees, including Stephen, leaving 38 unknown prints. As for the wristwatch, 3 different DNA samples were found on it. The problem was that these samples were not enough to create a full profile since DNA analysis technology was not yet advanced enough in 2001. As a result, experts had to work with partial profiles. They tried to add them to databases, but the results were inconclusive. The system showed them 19 possible matches, and during the investigation, the police confirmed that none of these people were related to the murder. However, the experts were able to directly compare the obtained samples with other DNA. They determined that one of the samples belonged to Carrie and the other 2 did not match any of the park employees, including Stephen. Detectives did not rush to rule him out as he had a motive and opportunity to commit the crime. But there was no evidence against him. No other leads were found and the case remained unsolved for months. A year after the murder, a prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward to the police. He told them that his cellmate, Anthony Powers, had boasted to him about being responsible for Carrie's murder. Detectives investigated and found that Powers had an extensive criminal history, mostly for bank robberies, which had landed him in jail multiple times. Interestingly, Powers had escaped from prison shortly before Carrie's murder and was caught after the fact. His fingerprints and DNA did not match those found at the crime scene. Moreover, the witness's description of the murder did not match reality. The detectives concluded that both prisoners were attempting to deceive them for a reward of $50,000 for information leading to solving of the case. Since Powers was already serving a life sentence, additional charges did not scare him. Additionally, in the event of a guilty verdict, he could have avoided being transferred to a federal prison and remained in the state correctional facility, which he preferred. The case remained unsolved for several years. Detectives regularly reviewed the case, hoping to find new evidence, but their efforts were fruitless. They even put up a photo of Carrie in their office to remind themselves of the case every day. In 2007, the case was reopened. By that time, DNA analysis technology had significantly advanced and experts re-examined the wristwatch. This time, they were able to identify 3 precise DNA profiles, one belonging to Carrie, the second to an unknown man, and the third to an unknown woman. Both of these samples were run through the state database, but no matches were found. Then the detectives remembered an interesting detail. A special sticker was found on the pack of cigarettes discovered next to the victim's body. In those days, each state had to label tobacco products, so the police knew for sure that the pack was purchased in South Dakota. The detectives then sent the DNA samples to their colleagues in that state. And here they had a long-awaited breakthrough. When they ran these profiles through the South Dakota database, one of them showed a complete match. The man turned out to be 35-year-old Randy LaRoyal Swaney. This name had never appeared in police reports in Carrie's case, so it was a surprise for the investigators. Randy turned out to be a serial robber, and at that time, he was serving a 30-month sentence in a South Dakota prison. At the time of the murder, he was out on parole. The police also discovered that he had a light-colored Oldsmobile Delta at that time, which matched the witness's description. The investigators checked his fingerprints, and they matched several prints found at the murder scene. Despite all this, detectives wanted to gather as much evidence as possible before charging him. Randy had only 1 month left to serve in prison, so the police decided to act as quickly as possible. They spoke to his wife, not mentioning what her husband was suspected of. The woman was already used to Randy regularly coming to the attention of the police for robberies and thefts, so she was not surprised by their visit. The detectives showed her photos of a watch, and the woman immediately confirmed that they belonged to her husband. She also said that she sometimes wore them, and the investigators immediately realized that the last DNA sample from the watch belonged to her. Then they decided to reveal everything and told her that they suspected her husband of killing a young woman. The woman burst into tears, but the police quickly realized that she was primarily scared for herself. Learning that her DNA might be on the watch, she thought that she too would be accused of the murder. On April 19th, detectives came to visit Randy in prison and attempted to speak with him without specifying what he was being suspected of. However, Randy refused to talk without a lawyer present. After the unsuccessful interrogation, Randy called his wife. As all prison calls are recorded, the police were able to listen in. The woman was angry and asked, "What did he do?" She revealed the detectives were investigating him for a murder that occurred in Blue Mound State Park and was more worried about her DNA being found on a watch. At times, she began to cry and scream that she didn't want to go to jail for a crime she had nothing to do with. Randy, on the other hand, repeated that he knew nothing about it. The woman actively cooperated with the police, providing her DNA samples and allowing them to search their home. She also gave them several photos of Randy, one of which showed him sitting behind the wheel of a white car similar to the one witnesses saw. In another photo, the man's watch was visible and was fastened to the fourth class, just like the watch found at the crime scene. Additionally, his wife confirmed that Randy smoked the same brand of cigarettes that were found near the body. All of this was enough to take the case to trial. Randy was charged on May 8, 2007, one day before his release. He was immediately transferred to a prison in Minnesota, and the prosecution began preparing for the trial. According to their version of events, Randy initially chose the park building as an easy target for robbery. There were no cameras or guards, but there was cash. When he entered, Carrie may have been in another room. Seeing that nobody was there, Randy began stealing money from the cash register, but the young woman returned and caught him in the act. A struggle ensued, and the man may have used threats to make her open the safe. Afterward, he took a decade of stone and struck her more than 5 times because he feared leaving a witness alive. Even his relatives, including his wife, testified against him in court. They all said that Randy regularly committed thefts, used to ban substances, and had serious gambling problems which constantly put him in debt. His former cellmate told how Randy mentioned leaving his watch at the crime scene. Another cellmate claimed that after the police came to interrogate Randy in jail, he said, "This time they got me. I'm looking at life." Randy's lawyers insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. According to their version, Randy lost his watch sometime before the incident and the real killer found it. However, this version conflicted with the results of DNA analysis. There were 3 samples of genetic material on the watch: Randy's, his wife's, and Carrie's. Randy claimed that on that day he went fishing near a town about 150 kilometers away from the park. However, since he supposedly was there alone, no one could confirm his alibi. He also said that he had been in the park only once, long before the murder. He admitted that he left his fingerprints there at that time. There was another discrepancy. One of Randy's fingerprints was found on a leaflet that was made only 4 days before the murder. All defense arguments had no weight and contradicted real evidence. And Randy's lawyers tried to blame someone else. First, he called Powers and another inmate to testify, but their stories still did not match reality. Then he began to harass the victim's fiancée, constantly hinting that he could be the real killer. The trial lasted until August 15, 2008. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Randy guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After that, he continued to insist on his innocence and filed multiple appeals, but they were all rejected. From the beginning, all his defense was built on absurd versions that contradicted DNA analysis and other evidence, so there are no chances for his case to ever be reconsidered. Share your opinion about this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video. A woman was found dead in her own home. Police started investigating and immediately found several concerning leads. The longer they looked into the case, the more strange and terrifying details surfaced. After several years, they finally uncovered the truth, but nobody expected such a turn of events. Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948 in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of her siblings from a young age. The girl was into sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Additionally, she loved art and wanted to work in that field. After finishing high school, Karen enrolled in Nazareth College in Rochester, where she received a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science degrees. After that, she worked as an art teacher in an elementary school for several years and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35 years old, she moved to Florida where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager in an organization that provided consulting services to Vietnam veterans, and he and Karen quickly became mutually attracted. The couple dated for just over a year, and in the spring of 1984, David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport. Before this, Karen lived in an apartment with her friend, and she constantly had to drive to David's house. The woman accepted this offer and began gradually moving her things there. On May 22nd, Karen took the remaining items from her apartment and finally moved out completely. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David had gone to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she would have to spend a whole week alone in his house. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend's house. They had a great time there. Karen told her friend that she was very happy with David and was glad she would finally be living with him. The friends talked until about midnight, after which Karen went to David's house. The next day, he called home several times, but no one answered. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her neighbor, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. After that, David called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them had seen her. He continued to try to reach her all day, but he never got an answer. On the next day, May 24th, David called home again early in the morning, hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but there was still no answer. Later, he called her boss and found out that she had not shown up for work. At this point, David's concern reached its peak and he feared that something bad may have happened to Karen. He then called local hospitals and police stations to inquire if they had seen anyone matching Karen's description. Upon learning that they had not, he decided to call his neighbor, Amy. David asked her, "Is Karen's car parked in front of the house?" Amy looked out the window and replied, "Yes." This only added to David's worry. He asked Amy to go to the house and knock on the door. He was so anxious that he stayed on the line with her until she left to fulfill his request. Amy approached the side door and knocked, but there was no answer. She then walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. She called out Karen's name several times, but there was no response. She extended her arm through the open window, pulled back the curtain, and was shocked by what she saw. The window was in the bedroom, and through it she could see the hallway where a bloodied female body lay on the floor. Amy couldn't see the face because she was behind a wall. She knew it was likely Karen. After recovering from the shock, Amy ran back to her own house where David was still on the phone. She grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened before hanging up and calling 911. Doctors quickly arrived at the scene, but were only able to confirm Karen's death. Detectives began investigating the crime scene, which horrified even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood throughout the house, Karen had fought her attacker until the end. Bloodstains led from the hallway to the front door, where several fragments of glass had been smashed. Detectives noticed several strands of hair matching Karen's hair color stuck in the broken glass. They theorized that she had almost made it outside but was caught by her attacker. In the bathroom, investigators found their first lead: a bloody footprint on the floor. Police checked Karen's feet and found no bloodstains, so the footprint must have belonged to her killer. However, it was unclear why the killer was walking around barefoot in the bathroom. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds and had been subjected to violence. Before we continue, I have a small request for you. We've created a new channel where we upload content related to old, historical ruins and interesting events. So, if you're interested, kindly subscribe to my channel, Decoverize, for daily interesting videos and show some love in the comments. I'll read every one of your comments. The link is in the description. Experts also extracted biological material from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not used in 1984, so this clue could not help to identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body, but they were too smeared to be used. According to experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before she was discovered. This meant that she was attacked on the same night when she returned home from her friend's place. There was another detail that immediately caught the attention of the police and doctors as soon as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a shirt and a lace corset was on top of it. Apparently, the perpetrator did this. When the police finished examining the crime scene and collected all possible clues, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning up. The women did not want David to see all this horror. When he arrived, all the victim's acquaintances knew how much he loved her and wanted to ease his suffering at least a little. David's conference was taking place on the other side of the country, so he needed a lot of time to return home. Meanwhile, the detectives began questioning the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe, and the crime rate was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. This is a form of agreement between neighbors when they keep an eye on order and report any suspicious things to the police. However, in this case, the neighborhood watch did not perform its functions. Detectives found out that on May 23rd, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing female scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream quickly stopped and they did not get the impression that someone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite the victim, did not consider it necessary to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man walked down the street and did not notice anything suspicious, after which he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23rd, she saw that the front door of his house was open, and she also heard a scream that night but did not associate it with the open door. In her story, there was one detail: when the police called, the door was locked. Considering that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the culprit could have returned and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It was noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator may have climbed in through the back window, but there were also no signs of forced entry there. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and let him in herself. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. On the evening of the day after Karen's murder, an unknown man pulled up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door a few times, and kept looking around. Then he returned to the car, but a few minutes later, he came back with a piece of paper in his hand. He placed it on Karen's car windshield and only then drove away. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the windshield that said, "Karen and David, hi, I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back, but I have what you asked for." The detectives immediately noticed the wording, "no signs of life." Given that at the time this person arrived, Karen had been dead for almost a whole day. Such a choice of words was very alarming. The note ended with the name Peter, and investigators tried to find him. It turned out that he had been right under their noses the whole time. The man learned about it from Karen's former neighbor and came to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all the questions. He voluntarily provided his fingerprints and footprints and also told them what he was doing near the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days before this, Karen called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one detail: that David would also be there, even though at the time he was already scheduled to go on a week-long business trip. The detectives also asked Peter what he meant in the note by the phrase, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed a cassette from them and was planning to return it. Another strange detail was that Peter allegedly did not notice the glass shards almost all over the path to the front door, let alone the several broken windows. The man insisted that he hadn't seen anything or paid attention to it. During the conversation with him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. When the police officer looked at his hand, the man covered the spot and said that he always gets scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above looked extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said that on the night of the murder he was sleeping at home, and his neighbor confirmed this. The police didn't rush to exclude him from the list of suspects since such an alibi could easily be a lie. However, the investigators quickly came up with another suspect. David, Karen's boyfriend. According to his words, that night he was in Rhode Island, which is located 2,000 kilometers away from his home, and he was sleeping in his hotel room. But at the crime scene, the police found a very interesting clue. A local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23rd, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David could have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and returned before his next conference appearance. They calculated the flight and travel times from airports and concluded that it was indeed possible. Additionally, no one could confirm David's alibi for that night since he allegedly slept alone in his hotel room. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observations. He had repeatedly noticed that Karen and David argued when the woman came to his house. David, on the other hand, insisted that they had a wonderful relationship and the couple hardly ever fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21st at a store near his home. He was going to take it with him on the trip to have the weather forecast for the week. They sold that newspaper. He even remembered that David bought it on the 21st. According to the clerk, the publication actually released that issue several days ago, which is normal for printed newspapers. Thus, suspicions against David faded into the background. They asked him if anything was missing from her house, and the man noticed the absence of a white lace corset that Karen had bought for herself a few months earlier, one very similar to the one worn by Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to think that the depraved criminal had taken it as a trophy. The police decided to pursue another lead found in the victim's house. A high-quality drawing of a watch signed with the name Stephen Fischler. One particular detail caught the detectives' attention. The paper appeared to be covered in blood. The detectives quickly discovered that Stephen worked with Karen in the same company and questioned her colleagues. They uncovered a lot of interesting information. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange person. He persistently tried to court all the female colleagues, shared pictures with them depicting perverted things, and even tried to get a little bit of a sense of humor. And even wrote a perverted poem and tried to persuade his colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him admitted that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but management didn't give it much thought. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen that drawing. He also claimed that he barely knew the victim and offered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly organized such a test, and that's where the most interesting part began. At first, everything was calm, but after one of the questions, Stephen suddenly said that he killed Karen. Literally a few seconds later, he took his words back and said that he had nothing to do with it. What was strange was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not detect a lie. This confused the detectives, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph results. This instrument is far from perfect and simply cannot accurately determine whether a person is lying or not. At the same time, they understood that Stephen was clearly a very strange person and could say anything. Soon, experts studied his drawing and concluded that the red stain on it was left by ketchup, not blood. As a result, that began to doubt whether Stephen was involved in Karen's murder. Despite such a number of suspects, the police still couldn't gather enough evidence against anyone, and the case remained unsolved for several months. Detectives continued to investigate, but they couldn't find any new leads. This continued until December, when something interesting happened. One of the respected residents of Gulfport was retiring, and in honor of this event, local residents organized special events. Many people attended, including a woman named Mary who struck up a conversation with a police officer who was also present. During their conversation, they discussed the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she too had heard her piercing scream that night. The officer immediately noted one strange detail. Mary lived 2 blocks away from Karen's house, and initially the police didn't even interview residents of such distant houses. The fact that the woman heard the scream indicated that it was really very loud. However, the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described it as muffled. But if the neighbors 2 blocks away heard it, the man clearly could not consider it quiet, especially since at that moment he was in his garage with the door open. All this raised doubts, but the police were not quick to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch. He was 22-year-old George Lewis. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all the employees of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child, and all the neighbors spoke of him as a reliable and decent person. Nevertheless, detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come to the station when he had time. The man agreed but never showed up. It is worth noting that before this, he regularly stopped by the station just to chat with his friends. The chief detective in this case was even at his wedding, so it was difficult for him to imagine George as a killer. In January 1985, they managed to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem very loud to him. Perhaps this was due to the music playing from the radio. The detective asked him if he remembered anything else from that night, but George told him the same thing, except for one moment. When his testimony was taken for the first time, he said that he heard the scream, went out of the garage, and walked down the street. But this time, he stated, he just walked up to the road, looked around, and then returned. Considering that many months had passed since then, this discrepancy in the testimonies did not seem serious. However, the police still decided to make sure that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo a polygraph test. George agreed, but to their surprise, he did not pass it. In a subsequent conversation with detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He claimed that on the night Karen disappeared, he saw an unknown man near her house. George could only remember that the man was tall and had red hair and a beard. The detectives once again doubted whether he was telling the truth. George could not explain why he had not mentioned this man during the initial interview because the man knew where he lived and could harm his family. Despite this, the police tried to follow up on this lead and find the man, but the result was zero. Another nuance was that there was almost 30 meters between George and Karen's houses, and it was pitch dark outside. The detectives doubted that the man could see the color of another person's hair under such conditions, but George insisted on his story. Recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away from him. He could not see any details, which made the detectives even more suspicious of his words. Nevertheless, they walked around the area and asked local residents, "Have you noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk on their streets at night?" To their surprise, several women admitted that they had occasionally seen a man who looking into their windows in the dark. None of them saw the face of this man, but one woman managed to notice him and, according to her, he looked very much like George Lewis. She was not 100% sure because it was dark outside and the man immediately ran away. George admitted that he did sometimes look into his neighbors' windows, but he insisted that he did it solely for their safety. He said he was just trying to make sure everything was okay with them since he was responsible for the security of his neighborhood as the head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only strengthened the suspicion against him. In March 1985, George agreed to a second polygraph test. This time he changed his story again. He admitted that not only did he see a man in front of Karen's house, but he also approached him to talk, and the man threatened to kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator once again detected a lie, so the investigator asked George directly, "Did he kill Karen Gregory?" The man answered negatively, and once again his words were considered false. Afterwards, the detectives decided to talk to George's wife, who told them that she had woken up that night from a piercing scream and was very frightened. She had tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there and the light in the garage was turned off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen waiting for her husband, who only returned half an hour later. The detectives also decided to delve into George's biography and spoke with his ex-wife, who admitted that the man only seemed kind, caring, and responsible. In reality, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent arguments. She added that he even choked her sometimes. Afterwards, the investigator spoke with George's close friends, who also shared some interesting information. Several months before the murder, when Karen was not yet living with him but periodically visited him, George told his friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man sometimes participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted Karen to join them. During these conversations with George's friends, the police also learned that in the summer of 1984, the man had a secret affair with a young woman who lived a few houses away from him. They spoke with her and learned something else. The young woman admitted that on her 17th birthday, George gave her a white lace corset. It was too big for her, but the man still made her wear it regularly. The police asked her to give them the corset and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said that an identical corset had gone missing from the house and that its size matched Karen's. It was the first serious evidence against George. But the detectives continued to dig further. They took a footprint from him and sent it to FBI experts to compare it to the footprint found on the bathroom floor in Karen's house. After some time, the results came in. A complete match. In March 1986, George was called back to the police station and the detectives asked several times, was he in Karen's house on the night of the murder? The man denied it until the detective told him about the result of the examination. For the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything. But then he gave the police a new story. This time he said that he saw a red-haired man near Karen's house, then ran to her house and saw that everything around was bloody and the woman was lying in the hallway with a cut on her throat. Afterwards, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to remember that horror again. Of course, detectives didn't believe his story for a second because it sounded completely unbelievable. But George was right about one thing. There was indeed a cut on the victim's throat which hadn't been disclosed publicly. Even if his story was true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut due to the large amount of blood on Karen's body. At least experienced medical experts couldn't see it until the blood was washed away. This meant that George could only know about the cut if he was the killer. All of the above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15th, almost 2 years after the murder in the state of Florida. He could have faced the death penalty for what he did. George's close friends and colleagues in the fire department didn't share the police's certainty that he was the killer. They still considered him a good person and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child and even raised $300,000 for bail. Several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months and the trial didn't begin until June 4, 1987. George's lawyers insisted that the man hadn't killed anyone and never changed his version of events in conversations with the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. Its beginning was the same. He saw a man near Karen's residence, ran into the house and saw her body. This sight made George very sick and he ran to the bathroom where he vomited. Apparently, this was how he tried to explain the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But there was one obvious nuance here. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody traces would have been from where he found her body to the bathroom. But they weren't there. When asked why he didn't call the police, George said that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone about it. It's worth noting that the man had been a firefighter since he was 18 and regularly dealt with horrific situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly couldn't even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had feelings for Karen. For several months, he waited until her boyfriend left for a week and decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. Although the woman managed to scream and even resist him, in the end he killed her and subjected her to violence. As for the footprint of his foot on the bathroom floor, there could be a simple explanation. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes stained with Karen's blood in the bathroom and took off his shoes with socks, which also got blood on them. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due to be announced, the judge suddenly scheduled a retrial. George's lawyers pushed for this, and they succeeded. They insisted that some evidence had been compromised by the police, and the prosecution had not been able to fully prove their client's guilt. The judge's decision came as a shock to all participants in the process, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor was able to challenge this decision, and in 1989, it was overturned. In the end, George was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was ruled out because the man had no criminal history prior to the murder. Since then, George has tried to challenge his sentence several times but has been denied each time. Many of his friends and relatives continued to believe that he was innocent despite all the facts and evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014 at the age of 52. He insisted on his innocence until the very end and even gave an interview in which he talked about how difficult it was to bear the punishment for a crime he did not commit. In this whole story, one important point should be noted. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was located near their street, the patrol could have arrived at the scene in a matter of minutes. The detectives who worked on this case admitted that in such a case, Karen's life could have been saved. But it did not happen. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed it. A woman in Australia left her home and disappeared without a trace, leaving her husband and 2 children behind. Relatives tried to contact her, but after several weeks of unsuccessful attempts, they decided to turn to the police. An investigation was conducted, and it was concluded that the woman was not in danger and had the right to control her own fate. Since then, she has not contacted her family, and only 40 years later that they learned the shocking truth. Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948 in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School. And in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a childcare center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage, but Lynette finally became pregnant. The couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, but soon the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person, and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally. But she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family, and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day, and her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years, but they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her 2 daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called their home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started 1st grade, as the school year in Australia begins in January. But Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her. While Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters, so they believed that she had been kidnapped where some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence of the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in a local newspaper calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover, who had moved in with him on January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing. Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying. Police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris' arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000 when police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. That Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened. Due to the complete lack of evidence, the man could not be convicted. But investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance. And 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In cases where a monetary reward is promised, there are always many people who want to earn some extra money. They are ready to make up any information, just to get the money. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home, trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast's author, Hadley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads. Although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris, the public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The wait dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him. So they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their clients and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette, who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body, testified in court. And Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors who witnessed the man beating her also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her. She was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out on dates. He was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce, so he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris' lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction and hid it. Because the police were negligent in their work in those years, no proper investigation was conducted. Although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks and on August 30, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced 24 years in prison with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of considering that he will be 92 years old by then. Chris may simply not live to see the time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so that the family could finally bury her. But Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence, but even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved in large part thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video. A young mother was found dead in her bedroom. From the very beginning of the investigation, detectives faced almost complete lack of evidence. However, soon the case took a very unexpected turn. As a result, they learned shocking details that changed the course of the case and allowed them to uncover the truth. Michelle Young was born on February 17, 1977 in the small American town of Sayville, New York. From an early age, the girl was characterized by perseverance and determination. She set ambitious goals for herself and made every effort to achieve them. In school, she excelled academically and was captain of the cheerleading team. She also chose a career path quite early in life. To obtain the necessary education, Michelle enrolled at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She also joined the local cheerleading team, but later decided to leave it and fully focus on her studies. For years later, she earned a master's degree and almost immediately after that, she got a job at a local accounting company. Her position provided a decent income right from the start. She rented an apartment in a good area and devoted a large part of her time to climbing the career ladder. In February 2001, while celebrating her 24th birthday with friends, Michelle met a man named Jason. He was several years older and had graduated from the same university as her. The couple quickly found common ground and soon they started dating. Jason worked as a sales agent in a large company that produced power tools. He lived in another city and at the time of their meeting, he was in Raleigh on business. After meeting Michelle, he started visiting there more often and at other times they communicated by phone. Later, he permanently moved to the city and after some time, he and Michelle started living together. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant. Couple decided to get married. On March 29, 2004, their daughter Cassidy was born and the family moved into a large house located in a prestigious area on the outskirts of the city. Around the same time, Michelle's sister, Meredith, moved to Raleigh and regularly helped the family take care of the child. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant again and she and her husband decided they lived in a city called Brevard, which was 400 kilometers away from their home. Unfortunately, instead of a celebration, the trip turned into a tragedy. On the very day the couple planned to return to Raleigh, Jason and Michelle were involved in a serious accident that caused her pregnancy to be terminated. The family was devastated by the news, but just 2 months later Michelle became pregnant again. After a while, the couple found out that they were having a boy, and they eagerly awaited his birth. On November 2, 2006, Jason left for another city for work. As a sales agent, he regularly traveled around the country for business meetings and negotiations. This time he was headed to a town called Clintwood, which was about 490 kilometers away. That day, Michelle invited her friend, Shelley, to visit. The women talked until evening, after which the friend went home. The next morning, Jason called his wife's sister, Meredith, and told her that before leaving for another city, he found some designer women's bags on an online store with a good discount and wanted to order one for Michelle as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. After his departure, he remembered that he had printed out several pages with these bags and left them on the table in his home office and learn about the upcoming gift. So he asked her sister to go to their house and take them. Meredith agreed and came to their house at around 1 p.m. At that moment, she did not have the keys with her and Michelle was supposed to be at work. But the woman knew that the door to their garage was broken and could be easily lifted by hand. She did just that but immediately noticed something strange. Her sister's car was parked inside. Thinking that she had gone to work, Meredith walked into the house. Upon entering the kitchen, she saw Michelle's purse lying on the floor. The woman called her sister by name, but there was no answer. Instead, she heard their dog barking, which was also strange. When Jason and Michelle left the house, they always let the dog out into the backyard. The woman noticed something red on the floor in the bedroom. Approaching closer, she realized with horror that it was a bloodstain and next to it was her sister Michelle. She was lying face down. Meredith approached her sister and tried to turn her over, but immediately felt that her sister's body was cold. The woman panicked and immediately called 911. At the same time, Cassidy, the 2-year-old girl who was hiding under the bed next to where the body lay, crawled out and ran to her aunt when she saw her. Meredith called the police and led her outside where they waited for the officers. When the woman was speaking to the operator, he asked, "Is the child okay?" Meredith examined her and found no visible injuries. The only thing she noticed was small blood stains all over the room, which she immediately realized were the child's footprints. The child was immediately handed over to the doctors for examination, and the police began to investigate the crime scene. They immediately noticed something strange. There were bloody footprints of a child all over the room. However, Kennedy's feet were completely clean. Additionally, there wasn't a single drop of blood on the girl. The footprints led to the bathroom in only one direction. Blood stains were found on the inside of the bathroom door, apparently left by the child's hand. Based on all of this, detectives constructed the most obvious version of what had happened. After the murder, the girl was locked in the bathroom for a while and then someone came in and washed Cassidy clean of blood. Later, when the police talked to Michelle's friend, they learned another interesting fact. Shelley said that they put the girl to sleep together the night before and she was wearing a diaper. However, when the victim's sister came to her house, the child was not wearing a diaper. Based on this, the investigators concluded that the same person who washed the blood off the child also removed the diaper. The detectives did not find any signs of a break-in in the house. They discovered that Michelle's 2 rings, wedding and engagement, were missing from her hand, but all other valuables were in their place, including cash, ruling out the scenario of robbery. Were found on her body and near her, and 4 DNA samples were found on the jewelry box that did not belong to Michelle or her husband. Several fingerprints were also found in the house that did not belong to anyone in their family. In the bedroom where the victim's body was found, experts discovered 2 shoe prints of American size 10 and 12 with the pattern on the soles. They were even able to determine the model of the shoes. Additionally, detectives noticed blood splatters on the door of the closet with clothing. However, the door was open and the splatters were arranged in a way that suggested the door should have been closed when they landed. On Jason's home office computer, the police found something interesting in the browsing history. Besides pages from a women's handbag store and a search for directions to Clintwood, there were several alarming search queries such as anatomy of a knockout, loss of consciousness from head trauma, and related topics. Medical experts concluded that Michelle died from a head injury inflicted by a heavy object. The perpetrator struck her over 30 times. And at the time of her death, she was 5 months pregnant and her baby did not survive the attack. The exact time of Michelle's death was not determined, but experts speculated that it most likely occurred at 5 or 6 in the morning. The brutality of the crime suggested that the perpetrator may have known the victim and harbored a strong dislike towards her. As usual, the detectives first looked into Michelle's husband. They spoke with her friends and relatives who provided them with a lot of interesting information. Their marriage was quite problematic as Jason and Michelle often argued over domestic issues. Furthermore, Jason was not happy when his wife became pregnant with their first child. He asked her to terminate the pregnancy, but Michelle refused. When Michelle became pregnant again after an accident they were involved in, Jason was once again not pleased with the news. It seemed like the couple might divorce in the foreseeable future. Meredith also told the police that Jason's request to retrieve the handbag printouts initially seemed strange to her, considering the obvious problems in their marriage, and it had already been over 3 weeks since their anniversary. However, one obvious fact contradicted the theories of Jason's involvement. At the time of the murder, he was in another city that was 490 kilometers away. And called the police. She also informed their relatives about what had happened. Michelle's mother called Jason's parents while he was on his way from Clintwood to visit them. He decided to stop by his parents' house before heading home, and upon arrival, they told him about what had happened. Jason was shocked by the news and immediately left for Raleigh with other relatives. During this trip, a friend called Jason and told him that the police were asking a lot of questions about him. Jason made a strange decision and said he didn't want to talk to the police and wanted to hire a lawyer, which only increased the investigators' suspicions but also gave them a new lead. Shelley, who was visiting the victim the day before the murder, told the police something interesting. Michelle had told her that she had been feeling like someone was constantly watching her lately. Shelley herself also felt like someone was watching them through the window that evening and even asked her friend to walk her to her car because she was a little scared to leave the house alone. Detectives tried to find any evidence related to possible surveillance but continued to investigate Jason's potential involvement. Jason left his house in his car on November 2nd in the afternoon and, considering it was about a 6-hour drive to Clintwood, decided to stop and stay at the Hampton Hotel, which is roughly halfway on the route. Detectives requested surveillance footage from this hotel and actually saw Jason check in at 10:54 p.m. and 2 minutes later he used his key card to enter his room, and the card was not used again after that. The next morning around 7:40 a.m. he called his mother and the signal passed through a cell tower located near the town of Whiteville. This town was on the way from the hotel to Clintwood, where his business meeting was supposed to take place. The police also found out that the meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but Jason arrived 30 minutes late. When Jason arrived home with his relatives, the police seized his white Ford Explorer. Forensic experts could not find any blood or other evidence in it. They also examined the hotel room where the man stayed, but nothing was found there either. The same applied to all of Jason's clothing and belongings. Interesting, a pair of size 12 boots of the same brand were found in his car, the tracks of which were discovered in the house, but it was a model with a completely different pattern on the sole. A DNA sample was taken from the man by court order, which did not match the 2 hairs found. The victim's body. His fingerprints were also taken, although this was not particularly useful as they were everywhere in his home, of course. Experts could only determine that none of the fingerprints found contained traces of blood. Thus, the police were unable to find any evidence that could connect Jason to the murder. He did not speak to the police and used the services of a lawyer. When the police searched Jason's car, they found a hotel receipt and a fresh newspaper. A Hampton employee said he had slipped them under the door of his room somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. This meant that the man was definitely in the hotel that morning. In the end, a rather complex situation arose. Jason could have killed his wife only if he had left the hotel unnoticed in the middle of the night. Driven 270 kilometers to his home, committed the crime, cleaned his daughter of blood, then driven 270 kilometers back and quietly entered his room so that the electronic key did not register it. Detectives tried to figure out if this was possible in principle. They interviewed hotel staff, and here they came across an interesting lead. One of the employees noticed that the fire door on the first floor was slightly open, held open by a small redstone. The employee was surprised because this door was always closed from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. He pulled out the stone from under the door and closed it. After that, the man decided to check the surveillance cameras and saw that one of them was not working. The one located on the stairwell next to the door. The employee approached it and realized that someone had disconnected the wire from the camera. He asked his colleague to return the wire to its place, and around 5:50 a.m. the camera started working again. From the recordings, the detectives established that the camera was turned off at 11:19 p.m. Then something interesting happened at 6:35 a.m. Less than an hour after the camera was reconnected, it suddenly turned to face the ceiling. Given that there was no automatic mechanism to change its position, there was only one option. Someone manually turned the camera so it wouldn't face the hallway. The hotel management claimed that the camera had never been turned off before, and the only time someone turned it towards the ceiling was a few years ago, when a guest wanted to leave the hotel unnoticed. This was a significant argument for the detectives that Jason could have left the hotel and gone home, then returned. The idea with the door and the camera was evident. The hotel's fire doors are designed in such a way that they can only be opened from inside the room. Jason could have used this door to leave the hotel without going through the main entrance, as he would have been seen by the employees and other cameras. Investigators interviewed all of Michelle's neighbors and interesting clues awaited them here as well. On the night of the murder, around 4 a.m., a woman was delivering fresh newspapers to their area near Michelle's house when she noticed a light-colored SUV but couldn't remember the model. Another neighbor left her work around 5:20 a.m. and also noticed a white SUV near Jason and Michelle's house. Passing by, she saw a man behind the wheel but couldn't make out his face. What was even more interesting was that there was a woman sitting next to him in the passenger seat. The neighbor thought she was trying to hide her face from her. The third witness drove past her house around 6:15 a.m. and also saw a white SUV there, but no one was inside. Detectives believed that this car belonged to Jason, but it was a complete surprise to them that there was a woman in the car with him. Attempts to identify her were unsuccessful, but during the investigation, detectives found out that the man had been cheating on his wife with her friend since college. The woman lived in Florida and Jason regularly went to see her under the guise of business trips. Detectives also discovered that the day before Michelle's murder, the lovers had called each other about 50 times, but the content of their conversations was unknown. Despite all this, the police still had no evidence linking Jason to the murder. He still refused to talk to the police without his lawyer present, but even in the presence of the attorney, he did not answer their questions. Detectives continued to actively work on the case and, ultimately, the investigation dragged on for many months. They were almost certain that it was Jason who committed the murder, but without substantial evidence, they were not in a hurry to arrest him. This happened only on December 14, 2009, 3 years after the murder. The investigators realized they would not be able to find any new evidence. So, they gathered all the available materials and charged him with murder. The trial began 2 years later in June 2011. The prosecution insisted that Jason had premeditated the murder of his wife because he did not want to lose part of his property in the divorce. According to their version, he had initially decided to stay at that particular hotel because it would allow him to return home to commit the murder and then drive back. Former girlfriends of Jason also testified at the trial. One of them recounted that he had proposed to her and given her a ring, but later during an argument he grabbed her hand and took the ring off her finger. Given that the killer had removed the rings from Michelle's hand, these statements seemed significant to the prosecution. And another woman turned out to be Jason's second mistress and a friend of Michelle. She revealed that she spent time with the man at his home when Michelle went somewhere. She was also married, and on one of those nights Jason removed her engagement ring from her finger. He did not return it until the next day, which seemed strange to the woman. Another mistress, a college friend of Michelle, also testified at the trial. She admitted that they had a romance. But the prints of their correspondence turned out to be much more interesting. Just a few days before the murder, he wrote to her, "I don't know how it all turned out this way, but I know how it will all end, with 2 broken hearts, but I don't care. I have a lot of suffering ahead of me, but you are worth it, even if only for a moment." Given that Michelle was killed just a few days after this message, its content was very disturbing. But one of the main witnesses was a woman who worked at a gas station between Raleigh and the town where Jason's hotel was located. She recounted that around 5:20 a.m. a man in a white SUV pulled up to the farthest pump. He tried to fill his car, but by law, people had to pay for gas first or show their ID at night. The driver went then threw $20 at her, filled the car with $15 worth of gas, and drove away without taking the change. The woman claimed to recognize this man from the photo. It was Jason Young. This witness changed the course of the case as thanks to her, it became known that Jason was between his home and the hotel early in the morning. This once again pointed to the fact that he could have killed his wife. At the trial, Michelle's sister, Meredith, also testified. After Michelle's murder, her daughter, Cassidy, stayed with her father, who moved in with his parents. For a long time, Michelle's relatives tried to obtain a court decision allowing them to take the girl to live with them temporarily. This went on for several years, and the lawyers were close to obtaining a positive decision when Jason simply relinquished full custody of Meredith, practically abandoning her. As a result, the girl moved in with her mother's relatives, who had been raising her without her father's involvement since then. Jason spoke for the first time at the trial, telling his version of events and denying that he killed his wife. He admitted that their marriage was falling apart, but insisted that they would have eventually divorced and he had no motive to kill her. His lawyers argued that there was no evidence against Jason and also tried to convince everyone that he could not physically have driven such a distance to kill his wife and return to the hotel early in the morning. They tried to calculate the average fuel consumption of his car and compare it with data on how often he refueled. According to the lawyers, he would not have had enough fuel to make the trip. It was not possible. Nonetheless, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial and schedule a new one for a year later. Against this backdrop, something else important happened. Michelle's relatives were convinced that Jason killed her, so they decided to file a civil lawsuit against him. Unlike in criminal trials, the required level of evidence for such lawsuits is lower, and the judge cannot sentence a person to prison. Jason completely ignored this lawsuit and decided not to participate in the process, which worked against him. After examining all the available evidence, the judge concluded that he was the one who killed his wife and Jason was ordered to pay $15 million to Michelle's relatives. In the retrial, which began in 2012, the prosecution was allowed to use the decision in the civil lawsuit as an argument in favor of the suspect's guilt. In addition, they discovered something else during the preparation. It turned out that a year before Jason's murder, he had bought boots with the same pattern, the bloody imprint of which was left in Michelle's room, but they had not been able to find those shoes. These additional factors only strengthened the case against Jason. And this time, the jury found him guilty of murder. The man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His lawyers tried to challenge the decision and they continue to file appeals to this day. But all of them are rejected. This case was widely covered in the media and its finale sparked heated discussions. On the one hand, over all these years, no physical evidence has been found that would connect Jason to the murder. On the other hand, a huge range of circumstantial evidence indicated that the man had orchestrated almost a perfect cover-up. If he had not stopped at the gas station that morning and had not caused a scene with the cashier, she might not have remembered his face. In that case, this case would still remain unsolved. As for the woman who was seen by a neighbor in the passenger seat of his car that night, everything is very ambiguous. There are no other clues that would indicate the involvement of other people in this crime. Other people's hair and DNA in the house did not guarantee this. It could have been left by one of the guests long before the murder. Nevertheless, the prosecution did not rule out 100% that someone could have helped Jason, but this moment remains a mystery. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. A woman was found dead in her own home and the police quickly solved the case. But what happened next is more reminiscent of a twisted detective movie than a real-life story. There are so many unexpected twists and shocking moments in this case that it is rightfully considered one of the most intriguing in history. Donna Brown was born on November 10, 1963 in Miami. She grew up in a large and friendly family with two younger sisters whom she had along with very well. When Donna was young, her parents divorced and she remained living with her mother. Despite this, her father remained actively involved in his daughters' lives and they remained quite close. After finishing school, Donna received medical training and became a surgical assistant at a local hospital. Her colleagues quickly grew to love her because she took her work seriously and was also a kind and open person. Her life was going quite well, but Donna wanted to start her own family for complete happiness. In the late 1980s, Donna went on a date with a man named Mark Winger, and she almost immediately knew she had met her match. Mark was charming and intelligent, worked as a nuclear engineer, and dreamed of having a large family. They began dating and decided to get married in 1989. Shortly after that, Mark received a job offer at a nuclear facility in Springfield, Illinois. It was a big step up the career ladder for him, and he and Donna decided to move there. The couple settled in a nice neighborhood, and soon after the move, Donna got a job at a local hospital. They only lacked children for complete happiness, but all their attempts were unsuccessful. At some point, Donna learned that she was medically unable to conceive, and it was a devastating blow for her. Both she and Mark dreamed of a large family, and all the conditions of their lives were favorable for it. But fate decided otherwise. Then the couple began to consider adoption, but kept postponing this serious step. This continued until 1995, when everything changed in one day. A pregnant underage girl was admitted to the hospital where Donna worked, and she wanted to give her child to a loving family. Mark and Donna immediately decided to adopt the baby. In June, right after the birth, they adopted a girl and named her Bailey Elizabeth Winger. The day they took her home coincided with the anniversary of their engagement. The couple and all the relatives were happy that they finally had a child. In August of the same year, Donna went to Florida with her 3-month-old daughter to visit her parents and introduce them to their granddaughter. The family had a great time, and sometime later, the woman returned home. She flew to the nearest airport, which was 2 hours away from Springfield, and then hired a taxi to her city through a special company. This trip greatly spoiled Donna's mood because the driver behaved quite inadequately. The whole way he talked about how several personalities lived in him, and they forced him to do various terrible things, such as killing people. In addition, the driver talked about how he regularly participated in orgies and even invited Donna to participate in them. The man also constantly violated traffic rules and drove the car quite dangerously. When Donna got home, she told her husband about it, and he was furious. Mark called the company the driver worked for and demanded that he be fired. It turned out that the driver was 27-year-old Roger Harrington. The management decided to suspend him from work, but that wasn't the end of it. During the next week, an unknown man called Winger's home phone, refused to identify himself, and asked for Donna. She and her husband suspected that the caller was Roger, and she was seriously concerned about her safety. Given that the man knew their home address, she was afraid that Roger might harm her. A distress call was made to the Springfield Police Department. Mark Winger was in a panic and reported that an unknown man had broken into their home and attacked Donna with a hammer. Mark, shocked and terrified, took his gun and shot the intruder. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found 2 bodies on the floor with Mark in a state of panic. The police officers detected a faint pulse from both individuals on the floor and called an ambulance while trying to obtain information from Mark about what had happened. Although Mark could barely speak, the detectives managed to piece together a rough idea of what had occurred. Mark explained that he was using the treadmill in the basement when he heard a noise upstairs. He went upstairs to the main floor and found his 3-month-old daughter unattended on the bed. When he went to another room, he saw an unknown man attacking his wife with a hammer. Mark panicked and grabbed his gun, shooting the attacker before calling the police. While waiting for the ambulance, one of the officers found a wallet in the attacker's jacket with documents belonging to a Roger Harrington. The detective knew this person well. Roger lived in a trailer park in Springfield and had a criminal history mostly related to minor offenses. He also had mental health issues and was generally known to be quite aggressive. Both Roger and Donna were taken to the hospital, where they died without regaining consciousness. Meanwhile, the police examined the crime scene, collecting evidence. Next to the bodies was a bloodied hammer, while Mark's gun was found on a table nearby, along with a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee. Mark told the detectives that the cigarettes and coffee were likely brought by the killer. The hammer was from his tool set, as he was planning to hang some pictures that day, so he prepared it and left it in the living room. Near the Wingers' home, Roger's car was found, and detectives discovered a note inside. It contained Donna's home address, Mark's name, and the time for 30 p.m. When asked if he knew the attacker, Mark initially denied it, but when the police mentioned Roger's name, Mark realized with horror that the driver was the same person. He told the detectives the story of how they knew Roger, his strange behavior towards Donna, and the creepy calls to their home number. The investigators spoke with acquaintances and relatives of Donna who were aware of her fears. She had repeatedly complained to them that she was seriously concerned about Roger and was afraid that he might come to her house one day and seek revenge because he lost his job after she complained to their superiors. Donna even wrote down all the details of her trip with Roger on a piece of paper in case she had to go to the police. The police found this paper at their house, and the investigation lasted for 2 days before the case was closed. No charges were brought against Mark for shooting Roger, because his actions were classified as self-defense. He continued to be in a state of shock, and his relatives flew to Springfield to support him and help take care of his daughter. Donna's relatives also provided him with all kinds of assistance. Months went by, and Mark continued to struggle with the loss of his wife, and his family began to notice negative changes in his behavior. He began drinking heavily, although he had never consumed alcohol before these events. He also often visited local bars. His relatives tried to support him in every way possible and help take care of Bailey, but ultimately they had to return to their own cities. Donna's parents understood that it would be difficult for Mark to take care of his daughter, so they suggested finding a nanny. In the end, Mark hired a woman named Rebecca Hondet, who specialized in round-the-clock childcare, so she spent most of her time at their house. Rebecca took care of the girl and got along great with her. Mark gradually began to recover, stopped drinking, and returned to work. This went on for several months, and during this time, a romance developed between him and Rebecca. She hardly ever left his house, and they spent time together with Bailey, constantly communicating, and eventually this lent a mutual sympathy. Rebecca also sincerely loved the girl, and a strong bond was formed between them. In 1996, a woman became pregnant, and Mark was given another chance to start a big and strong family. Rebecca also wanted this, and the couple got married in October. Mark and Donna's relatives were surprised that he started a new relationship just a few months after his wife's death, but ultimately supported him, as the new family was beneficial not only to him but also to Bailey. All the relatives sympathized with Rebecca, seeing her sincere love and care for the girl. Mark decided to sell his house because it constantly reminded him of Donna's death, and after what had happened, he did not want to raise children there. He and Rebecca decided to buy a house with a large plot of land outside the city, renovated it, and moved to a new house, and started to build their new life. Soon they had a daughter, and over the next few years, they had another daughter and a son. Thus, Mark and Rebecca raised 4 children, and the man's dream of a large family came true. Over time, Mark became more distant from Donna's relatives who tried to be present in their granddaughter's life. The problem was that Bailey didn't remember Donna at all and considered Rebecca her mother. Mark didn't want the girl to know about the tragic pasts of their family from an early age, and ultimately he forbade Donna's parents from calling her their granddaughter. They tried to persuade him, but in the end, they gave up all attempts. The relatives understood that it might be better for the girl to grow up away from what had happened. In the following years, Mark and Rebecca happily lived in their new home, raised their children, and made plans for the future. The tragedy of the past gradually faded, but its echoes continue to haunt the family. In 1999, Mark decided to sue the company that hired Roger Harrington as a driver. In Mark's opinion, this company did not make any effort to check this person's sanity, and as a result, it led to the murder of his wife. The company did not want to admit its guilt, and Mark hired a lawyer. To determine their guilt, the court decided to study all the materials of the case and the evidence, which were handed over to the lawyers. While they were preparing for the trial, something completely unexpected happened. In February of the same year, a woman named Deanne Schultz came to the police and told detectives a shocking story. Deanne was Donna's best friend and worked with her at the hospital. When Donna had a child, Deanne actively helped her take care of the girl, but Deanne's story turned everything upside down. She confessed to the police that she had been having an affair with Mark for several months, which they had kept hidden from their spouses. It all started 3 months before Donna's death. Around the same time, the couple adopted a daughter. Mark and Deanne were secretly seeing each other, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. The woman told detectives that Mark wanted to get rid of his wife to be with her. One day he said it would be so much easier if Donna just died. He then began to persuade Deanne to help him with a plan, but he did not reveal the details. Mark said that all Deanne needed to do was go to their house, find his wife's body, and call the police. The woman thought Mark couldn't be serious and was just joking, but he continued to share troubling things with her. After Donna complained to him about Roger Harrington's behavior, he told Deanne about it and said he had planned to frame the driver. He added that he just needed to figure out how to lure him into the house. A week before the murder, he called Deanne and asked if she would still love him no matter what, to which she answered yes. A few days after Donna's murder, friends and family gathered at their house to support Mark. When he was alone with Deanne, he said, "It seems like the police believe me, I did it for us." The woman was shocked, but Mark demanded that she not tell anyone, and she obeyed. They continued to secretly see each other and even exchanged rings, planning to get married in the foreseeable future. But in the following months, Mark started a romantic relationship with the nanny and eventually broke up with Deanne. She was devastated. She had kept this terrible secret from Mark, and he had traded her for someone else. Deanne never dared to tell the police about everything, realizing that part of the blame was her. Over the next few years, the woman repeatedly tried to take her own life, and only after 3.5 years did she finally overcome herself and go to the police station. The detectives were completely shocked. All this time, Mark had been considered a victim and even a hero who tried to save his beloved wife from a terrible killer. But Diane's story from a completely different angle. The investigators decided to re-examine the evidence, but they were met with an unpleasant surprise. All of it had been handed over to lawyers who were preparing Mark's case against the transportation company. It would take time to retrieve them, but some materials from the case remained at the station. The photographs from the crime scene, the lead detective looked at them and realized with horror that they had missed some obvious things all these years. The investigation had been quickly closed after the murder, as no one doubted Roger's guilt. But now, as the detective saw these photos for the first time, he realized that the positioning of the bodies did not match Mark's story at all. He had told them that when he entered the room, Donna was lying on the floor and that was striking her with a hammer from above, and then he shot him and Roger fell next to the woman. In reality, however, his body was lying in the opposite direction and he physically could not have fallen in that direction. The detective realized that Mark's story was a lie, and it made him rethink a whole series of moments that now made much more sense. First of all, no one ever figured out how Roger got into the house. There were no signs of a break-in, and Donna certainly would not have opened the door for him. But if you remember the note inside Roger's car, everything falls into place. It had Mark's name and the time, which looked like a reminder of a meeting. Remembering Deanne's story, detective concluded that Mark had somehow invited Roger to their home on some pretext, and let him in, after which he shot him. Secondly, in Roger's car they found a knife and several other items that he could have used for the murder, but he did not take them with him and used Mark's hammer, which the man took out of the closet on that very day and left in plain sight. All of this sounded completely illogical if you assume that Roger came to the house to kill someone. Moreover, he left a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee on their table. A very strange thing for a person who came there to kill. The detective listened to the recording of the 911 call made by Mark and was once again shocked. Mark told the operator that he had shot the attacker once, after which there was a male mumble in the background as if someone was trying to speak. Mark told the operator that his daughter was crying and he needed to go to her, after which she hung up. However, there is no hint of a child's crying on the recording. A more realistic scenario was that Mark did not shoot Roger once, and on hearing the gunshot, Donna ran to him and her husband hit her with a hammer. After that, he called the police and pretended to be panicked, reporting what had happened. Suddenly, Roger woke up and tried to say something, and those sounds were recorded on the call. Mark lied about his daughter crying, hung up, and shot Roger again. In support of this version, there was another fact that the investigators completely ignored. Mark and Donna's neighbors said during the questioning that they heard 2 shots. However, about 5 minutes had passed with Mark's story but completely matched the more realistic version in which he was the killer. But that wasn't all. During the initial investigation, which lasted only 2 days, the experts did not even examine the evidence. However, now that Mark decided to sue the transportation company, they hired lawyers and were going to win this case. The lawyers requested an independent examination of the clothing of all 3 participants in those events. The results spoke for itself. Blood spatters and traces indicated that Mark's story had nothing to do with reality. According to him, Roger was hitting Donna with a hammer, but there was not a drop of her blood on his clothes, not even the smallest, while there was plenty of blood from his wife on Mark's clothes, which directly indicated that he was not a real man, that he had killed his wife. The police took the evidence from the lawyers and conducted their own analysis, which showed exactly the same result. In the end, the police reopened the investigation, but this time it was about a double murder in which Mark became a suspect. His family was in shock. No one believed that the man was capable of such a brutal crime. Donna's relatives were skeptical of the suspicions against Mark until they heard all the information that the detective said uncovered. The only ones who insisted on Roger's innocence from the first day were his friends and family members. They were all aware of his minor criminal history but did not believe he was capable of murder. Moreover, their neighbor Roger, with whom they shared a rental, initially gave the police important information that they overlooked. Immediately after the murder, the detectives questioned the man and he told them that the day before, Roger received a call, hung up and wrote down Mark Winger's name, address and time on a piece of paper. It all looked as if Mark had scheduled a meeting with him, but the police did not attach much importance to it. Rebecca experienced the greatest shock from the whole situation. She knew Mark as a loving and caring father who had never shown any aggression during their time together. She refused to believe that this person could beat his wife with a hammer and frame someone else. After several weeks of investigation, the police decided to arrest Mark and he was arrested right at work. The case was sent to court. Mark was granted a $1 million bail. He could not raise that amount, so he remained in custody, awaiting trial. The trial did not begin until 3 years later, in May 2002. All his close ones and even Donna's relatives hoped that this would be a big misunderstanding and that the court would prove Mark's innocence. None of them were prepared for the opposite, and his lawyers insisted on the truthfulness of Mark's version. They noted that the crime scene photos could have been taken after the medics moved Roger's body, considering that the doctor's actions were not documented. It was possible to prove or disprove this possibility. In addition, the lawyers emphasized Roger's criminal history, his mental problems, and his inappropriate behavior with Donna during the trip. Deanne Schultz became the main witness in this case. By law, she could have been punished for keeping Mark's secret all these years, but the judge decided to grant her full immunity in exchange for her testimony. The male lawyers tried to discredit Deanne in every possible way, pointing out that she had attempted suicide multiple times, which could indicate psychological problems. The defense also suggested that she had made it all out of jealousy, seeking revenge on Mark. The prosecution insisted that the evidence and Deanne's testimony unequivocally pointed to his guilt. As for motive, it lay in the mistress's story. Mark lost interest in Donna long before they adopted Bailey. He'd been having secret affairs with her best friend, but he could not divorce Donna because he would have to split their expensive home and other assets, which was unacceptable to him. After Roger gave Donna a ride from the airport, Mark saw the perfect opportunity and decided to act. As terrible as it sounds, Mark was lucky. He encountered a man with a criminal record and mental illness who claimed to hear voices telling him to kill people. After Roger complained to management, he lost his job, which became the perfect motive when both the prosecution and defense laid their cards on the table, leaving only the jury's decision to wait for. Despite the compelling evidence against Mark, there were still doubts about his guilt among both his family members and on his relatives. None of them could imagine a loving father and respected member of society as a killer. Nevertheless, the jury unanimously found him guilty of the double murder. In the end, Mark received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Roger was posthumously exonerated. Rebecca could not believe that her husband had actually killed Donna. It took her a long time to impartially consider all the evidence of his guilt until she finally came to terms with the fact that he was truly a murderer. The chief detectives apologized repeatedly to Donna's and Roger's families for the sloppy initial investigation. He admitted his guilt in accepting the most logical version of events as the only correct one, overlooking all the contradictions. If you think that's the end of the story, then I have another unexpected turn for you. Even after the conviction, many doubted whether Mark had actually done it. But in 2006, those doubts were dispelled. In Mark's prison cell, they found 19 pages of handwritten text in which he was plotting to kill Deanne and another person. Mark wanted to hire a hitman straight from prison through other inmates or people on the outside. His desire to kill Deanne was understandable. He wanted to avenge the woman for revealing all his secrets to the police. The second person on the list was a man named Jeffrey Gelman, his childhood friend. Detectives quickly discovered the reason for such a decision. Mark asked him for $1 million bail, but the friend refused to provide such a sum. From these handwritten pages, it fell that Mark wanted to kidnap the man to get a solid ransom for him and then kill him. Why he needed money for life imprisonment was unclear. Perhaps he planned to eventually get out or escape. But in the end, the man faced another trial and received an additional 35 years in prison for planning a double murder. After that, no one doubted that Mark was the one who killed Donna. Rebecca raised 4 children alone, and they all know what kind of monster their father is. They changed their last names and do not plan to communicate with Mark. In 2019, Rebecca decided that Bailey should renew contact with Donna's relatives who had not seen her since she was 3 years old. Bailey was already 24 at the time, and she went to Florida and had a great time with them. They still communicate, and the young woman learns more about Donna from them. As for Mark, he is still in prison and denies his guilt. Perhaps he would never have been held accountable for what he did if it weren't for 2 factors that happened almost simultaneously. The first is the testimony of his former mistress. She could no longer keep the secret, especially watching how the killer creates a new family and raises children. The second factor is Mark's greed. Almost 4 years after the murder, he decided to sue his employer, Roger Harrington, for a substantial sum even though he was earning very good money himself. He did not expect third-party experts to study the evidence much more carefully than the local detectives. Interestingly, Diane decided to turn to the police, including after learning about this lawsuit. It became one of the last straws, and the woman revealed Mark's terrible secret. Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. The student returned home after a walk with friends. A few minutes later, she called her boyfriend with a worried voice and said that someone had come to her apartment. After that, she promised to call him back and hung up. But the call never came, and he decided to go to her house. What happened next turned into a long and complicated investigation, with the final point being made. Only 26 years later, Angela Samoda was born on September 19, 1964, in Alameda, California. She was the youngest of 5 children. When she was 1 year old, her father died and her mother raised them alone. After graduating from high school in 1982, Angela enrolled at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. She chose the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering, which was not the most popular direction for young women at the time. Because of this, Angela was one of the few young women in her class, but this did not prevent her from studying excellently and moving towards her chosen career. Angela also had many friends, and later she started dating a guy named Ben McCall. He was several years older than her and worked in a managerial position at a construction company. During the first few years of study, Angela lived in a dormitory, and during this time, she and her roommate, Sheila, became best friends. At some point, Angela decided to rent an apartment near the university and chose a residential complex 5 minutes from the campus. In addition, she got a part-time job to cover the rental expenses. On the Friday evening of October 12, 1984, Angela decided to go to a bar with her friends. The young woman also invited her boyfriend, but he had to go to work the next morning, so he declined. As a result, Angela went with her friend Anita and their mutual acquaintance named Russell. They visited several bars and had a great time, after which they decided to go home around 1 a.m. Since Angela hardly drank alcohol, she agreed to drive her friends home. First, they dropped off Russell near his apartment. Anita originally wanted to stay overnight at Angela's, but she planned to attend a football match early in the morning, so Anita asked to be taken to the dormitory. After that, Angela decided to stop by her boyfriend's house for a few minutes. She went in for a few minutes and then went home. Her apartment was just a few blocks away from Ben's home. After saying goodbye to Angela, he went to bed. But he woke up 10 minutes later from a call on his home phone. It was Angela on the other end, and her voice sounded very worried. At first, she just asked him to talk to her, which seemed strange to him. He could hear some noise in the background and tried to find out from her what was going on. Soon she told him that some man knocked on her door and asked to use her phone and bathroom. Angela did not specify whether she let him in voluntarily or the man entered the apartment without her permission. She asked Ben, "Are there any convenience stores nearby with a payphone?" The guy looked up a suitable store in the directory and gave her the address. She repeated this information to the man and told Ben that she would call him back soon and hung up. But the call never. Ben started calling her himself, but there was no answer. Then he got into his car and drove to her apartment. When he arrived at the house, he started knocking on her door, but there was only silence and response. Ben had a portable phone in his car that was given to him by the construction company. He dialed Angela's home number and walked back to her apartment. He heard the phone ringing, but no one answered. But then he thought that the young woman might have escorted the stranger to the convenience store with a payphone and decided to go there. But the salesperson said that no one had come to them, and Ben returned to Angela's apartment. He knocked on the door again and decided to call the police. It was almost half an hour before 2 policemen arrived at the house. Ben explained the situation to them and asked to open the door to Angela's apartment. But the officers did not rush to take any active action. They decided to contact the manager of the residential complex and ask him for a key before entering the apartment. The first thing the police officer saw was a shoe on the floor in the middle of the living room. Then they headed to the bedroom where they saw a horrifying sight. Angela was lying in bed, surrounded by a lot of blood, and she was not wearing any clothes. The police officers immediately noticed multiple stab wounds on her body. Later, experts counted 18 injuries. Investigators started examining the crime scene and noticed several bloodstains in the bathroom, presuming that they could belong to the attacker. In addition, several fingerprints were found in the apartment, but they did not lead to any results. Detectives also determined that the perpetrator had taken a kitchen knife, which was presumably the murder weapon. There were no signs of a break-in, indicating that the victim had let the attacker in, which matched Ben's story about the strange phone call. Medical experts determined that the victim had been assaulted, and they were able to extract biological material from the attacker. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not yet conducted in 1984, so the experts were only able to determine the attacker's blood type. Investigators began searching for a suspect, exploring all possible lines of investigation. First, they looked into all the employees of the residential complex who could have had access to the apartment. They then looked into men who had previously been convicted of violent crimes and lived in the area. But this also did not yield any results. Next, they focused on Angela's acquaintances and first interrogated her boyfriend. He told them about the phone call and the unknown man who came to see Angela. However, the detectives did not immediately believe him and considered the possibility that Ben may have killed her and made up the story. Nevertheless, the boyfriend agreed to provide his fingerprints and a blood sample. The experts determined his blood group was a fake, which did not match the killer's blood group. After talking to the victim's friends, the investigators identified another suspect, her ex-boyfriend, who she had dated in her own town. According to her friends, he sometimes behaved aggressively and once even threatened her with a knife. His blood group did not match the killer's blood group and he was no longer considered a suspect. The next suspect was Russell, who had spent time with Angela a few hours before her death. And here, the police received their first alarm. They could not locate him on the day after the murder. Digging deeper, they found out that on the morning of October 13th, Russell attended a wedding of acquaintances, after which he flew to another city to visit relatives. When he returned home the next day, he was taken to the police station for questioning. The young man insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder, but investigators doubted his sincerity. Russell lived alone and couldn't confirm that he was in his apartment that night. Additionally, detectives learned that Russell had a crush on Angela. He was several years older than her and worked as an architect. They met through mutual friends shortly before her death, and Russell tried to ask her out on a date, but she told him she had a boyfriend and they continued to communicate as friends. Detectives were also suspicious of the fact that Russell left town almost immediately after the murder. Given all of this, he quickly became the prime suspect. However, there were discrepancies in the new version of his involvement. According to Ben's story, an unfamiliar man came to Angela's. Considering the timeline of events, no one else could have killed her and left the apartment. However, detectives did not base their investigation solely on Ben's story, as they simply could not confirm it. In the following weeks, Russell was called in for questioning repeatedly, and each time investigators became more convinced of his possible involvement. Some detectives even privately spoke with near certainty that he was the killer. Sheila, Angela's best friend, was deeply affected by the news of her death. She was so afraid to be alone that she had to move in with her parents. And for the first month after the murder, she even slept in the same room as them. At the same time, she almost constantly followed the progress of the investigation, constantly calling detectives and meeting with investigators. Sheila told them about Angela's friends and acquaintances, hoping to help get to the truth. During one of these meetings, a detective told her that Russell was most likely the killer, but they didn't have enough evidence to hold him accountable. He then asked Sheila to meet with him and ask him a series of friendly questions, such as, "What were you doing a few days before and after the murder?" Match what he told them. A hidden microphone was attached to Sheila before the meeting. The young man told Sheila the same story, but the detectives didn't plan on giving up. They called him in for questioning again at the station and offered to conduct a polygraph test. Russell agreed and successfully passed it, but the investigators continued to consider him the murderer. They were so convinced of their rightness that during the interrogation they showed the boy photos of Angela's body, hoping that this gruesome sight would break him. But all of this yielded no results, and Russo continued to insist on his innocence. After 6 months of constant questioning, he hired a lawyer to investigate the case. Lawyer and refused to communicate with the police personally. After that, detectives placed him under round-the-clock surveillance, but eventually had to switch their attention to searching for other suspects. Russell left for London to receive additional education in architecture, and the investigators lost the ability to monitor him during all that time. The Angela case was actively covered in the media, and her relatives offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that could help find the killer, but this also yielded no results. During the investigation, the police had another suspect, a student at the same university as Angela. Investigators received an unconfirmed lead that this guy allegedly had a crush on the young woman and wrote her angry letters a few weeks before the murder. However, the detectives were unable to confirm any of this, and the young man had a reliable alibi. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years, with no new leads appearing for the police and all the old leads leading nowhere. After 10 years of silence, Sheila decided to call the police station and inquire about the progress of the investigation. By that time, she had already gotten married and had 2 children. Despite the fact that her life continued, she could not forget the tragic fate of her best friend and the fact that the guilty party still had not been punished. She spoke with the detectives, but they said that there had been no developments in the case. Sheila asked, have they tried to extract DNA samples from the killer's biological material? After all, it was already 1994 and DNA analysis technology was actively used by the police. However, investigators stated that the evidence in this case had been lost and could not be recovered. Sheila was not satisfied with these answers and continued to regularly call the detectives. Over the course of several years, she made over 700 calls, but each time she received generic responses. She even tried to independently pay for DNA analysis of all remaining evidence in a private laboratory, but was not allowed to do so. The problem was that she had no connection to the police and was an ordinary citizen, so her initiative was not taken seriously. Then Sheila came up with an idea. She thought about obtaining a private detective license. In her opinion, this would allow her to have more useful influence on the course of the investigation. And she began to study this issue. The woman began to study hard, and after several months, she successfully passed the exam and obtained her license. Despite this, she was unable to convince the investigators to reopen the case. She continued to make regular calls until July 2006 to a new unit specializing in unsolved murders. Sheila met with the chief detective and they began to work on the case together. To her surprise, she learned that the DNA sample from the victim's body had not actually disappeared and had been in the laboratory all these years. Apparently, she had been intentionally lied to because she had tired the investigators with her calls. Sheila convinced the new detective to send the DNA sample for analysis, and it finally happened. However, due to queues and bureaucracy, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results. On February 14, 2008, the detective received the DNA profile of the killer and entered it into the FBI database. He immediately saw a 100% match. And after 24 years, they had the killer's name. When the detective called Sheila and told her about it, she expected to hear that Russell was the killer after all. But to her surprise, the detective gave her an entirely unfamiliar name. The DNA from Angela's body matched the sample of a certain Donald Andrew Bess. The man, who was already over 60 at the time, was imprisoned for a series of rapes. In 1977, Donald abducted a young woman and subjected her to violence, for which he received 25 years in prison. As is often the case, he was released early. He was released from prison after 7 years in the beginning of 1984 when he was 36 years old. In that same year, he killed Angela and remained unpunished for decades. In 1985, he assaulted another woman and was caught by the police. The fact that he was on parole at the time of the crime became an aggravating factor, and Donald was sentenced to life imprisonment. Thus, he ended up in prison a year after Angela's murder. After gathering all the necessary information, detectives came to the correctional facility to conduct an interrogation. Donald denied his involvement in Angela's murder and insisted that he had never harmed women. Of course, the investigators were not quick to believe him, as his semen was found on the victim's body. But the man was not eager to give a confession, and the case began to be prepared for trial. The start of the trial had to be postponed due to serious health problems Donald had. A few days before the hearing, he had a heart attack. As a result, the trial began only on June 2, 2010. That he had not killed anyone, but the DNA test results spoke for themselves. His lawyer tried to emphasize his health problems and good behavior in prison in order to secure a lighter sentence for Donald. The prosecution, in turn, asked for the death penalty. According to the investigators, Donald noticed Angela in one of the bars or on the street, after which he began to follow her. He knocked on her apartment door and asked to use the phone and the toilet. After the young woman called her boyfriend and hung up, Donald attacked her and assaulted her. Detectives believed that the criminal was still in Angela's apartment when her boyfriend arrived and started knocking on the door. And Donald may have been afraid that his victim would scream. So he inflicted multiple stab wounds. After waiting for her boyfriend to leave, he left the apartment. The trial was heavily covered in the news, and this led to some unexpected consequences. Several women immediately went to the police and said that Donald Bess had subjected them to violence at different times. One of them was his ex-wife, who told the court about constant beatings from Donald. He raised his hand on her even when she was pregnant with his child, and after the birth of their daughter, he continued to physically abuse her. The wife had to run away and hide, fearing for the life of her child. As a result, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Angela and he was sentenced to death. He attempted to appeal the court's decision several times, but failed. Donald spent 12 more years in prison, and during that time, his execution date was never set. However, in October 2022, he died a natural death, another heart attack. Fatal. Thus, this complicated case came to an end. Investigators acknowledged that Sheila played a crucial role in moving the investigation forward by not giving up in her pursuit of the truth. After her story was publicized, relatives of other victims whose cases had gone unsolved for years began to reach out to her. As a result, Sheila decided to help these people and established a non-profit organization. Regarding Russell, the police department officially apologized to him for the months of persecution. He admitted that it had significantly affected his life and he was genuinely afraid of being convicted of a crime he did not commit. Despite this, he continued to try to help the police get to the bottom of the case. After all of these events, he became a well-known architect in Dallas. One aspect of the story that still troubles investigators is the possibility that Donald may have had many more victims even though he spent half of his life in prison. Perhaps sooner or later, they will be able to link him to other crimes. Please share your thoughts on the story in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.